Good morning, everyone. So good morning and welcome to the friends and members of ANZSOC. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you here today to mark the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the inaugural meeting of the Australian and New Zealand Society of Criminology. It was on this day, exactly 50 years ago, that a diverse group of people, some of you here today, came together in the Japanese room at the University of Melbourne. As some of you will well remember, although it bears the same name, this is not the actual room that we're gathering in today. Russell will tell you more about that in just a moment, but later today some of you will also be sharing your recollections of this time with us. Before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge the elders, families and descendants of the Wurundjeri people who have been the custodians of this land and are the current custodians. We acknowledge that the land in which we meet was the place of age-old ceremonies of celebration, initiation and renewal, and that local Aboriginal peoples have and continue to have a unique role in the life of these lands. Thinking about the history of the traditional owners of this land on which we're gathered, and also other lands throughout Australia and New Zealand, also prompts me to think more deeply about our own history, and indeed histories, and my own personal biography. I thought I'd share a little bit of my own biography with you today. Much of my career in criminology is available to see on staff web pages and in publication lists, but what a keen eye would see and be able to glean from this is my ongoing interest in history, both history of disciplines and of individuals. The truth is, I never planned on becoming a criminologist. It happened almost by accident. I started working at the former Criminal Justice Commission in the late 1990s. And from there, my career in criminology developed. Originally, I wanted to be a historian, or perhaps a writer of fictional, sweeping historical novels. That was what I imagined my life to be. My imagined writing certainly didn't involve writing academic papers about developmental criminology theory or complex longitudinal modelling. That seems to be what consumes my writing days these days. And it's not because I thought this would be a particularly bad idea, rather that as a young person growing up in Mackay in North Queensland, I was unaware that something like developmental criminology actually existed. Indeed, while I was a student of psychology and sociology, this area of criminology was very much in its infancy. I stopped studying history and English literature somewhere along the way, and as a new graduate with degree majors in psychology and sociology, I began my career working as a very ill-equipped youth worker in Mackay with young South Sea Islander boys. And it's been these boys and their families that I worked with whose history I've been reflecting on and thinking about when I think about the history of crime and criminology in Australia and also New Zealand, although I know very little of New Zealand's history. I'll take the opportunity to learn more when I read Deckett and Saar's book. I'd like to share with you today a little bit of the story of these South Sea Islander families, and it is my version of their story. These boys were descended from people who were brought in indentured labour to the sugarcane fields of Mackay. Trapping people in indentured labour was not a crime in the 1800s, and it is of course a whitewashing term to cover up a multitude of sins, including engaging people under false pretences, kidnapping and slavery. Unlike most of my contemporaries who grew up in Mackay at the time, I knew a little bit about the history of Mackay from some visiting archaeologists or anthropologists, I'm not sure I knew the difference at the time, who were working in Mackay when I was in high school. I used to detour from my ancient history class, which was close to the river, to check out what they were doing. They were uncovering some stone steps that had been hewn by hand by the South Sea Islander peoples in the late 1800s. The steps were at the back of my school, and what happened, according to these academics who were there working, what they taught me was each day after the people had been working in the sugarcane fields, these South Sea Islander people were brought into town, chained, and led down these steps, loaded onto barges and taken across the Pioneer River and locked away for the night at a place called Cremorne. George Orwell tells us that the most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. And we see attempts to do this by colonists that are repeated in many settings across place and time, in Australia and New Zealand, but elsewhere, of course. I'm not sure if the history that I grew up with was intentionally forgotten by the locals or just simply denied because the idea that the sugar industry and indeed the town were built on the back of slave labour. For these peoples who experienced this history, their family history of indentured labour and slavery has had devastating consequences. Many Australian-born South Sea Islanders were also deported as part of the White Australia policies in the 1900s. For those remaining to have their history denied for so long and additionally be disconnected from place is part of this legacy of Mackay. It wasn't until 1994, 2 years previous to when I started as a youth worker working in Mackay, that the Australian Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission found that South Sea Islanders, studied for the first time in Australia, had become more disadvantaged than Indigenous Australians. All of those present in the room will be well acquainted with the many ways in which British colonisation continues to have devastating impacts on Indigenous Australians. So you can appreciate how dire the situation was for many South Sea Islanders. It was not until 1994 that the Commonwealth Government recognised South Sea Islanders as a distinct cultural group in Australia. And it was not until 2000, the year 2000, that this group was recognised by the Queensland Government. At this time, the then Premier Peter Beattie also acknowledged and regretted in a public statement the unjust treatment, social and economic disadvantage, prejudice and racial discrimination that this group experienced, particularly in the sugarcane areas of Queensland. The history of South Sea Islander people in Mackay is just one small example of the devastation of British colonisation, both here and in New Zealand. It is a history of slavery and marginalisation. The failure of governments to recognise the existence of South Sea Islander groups until very recently has further reinforced this. However, against this backdrop of marginalisation, I also witnessed case after case of people who were able to have successful lives despite the dire circumstances in which they existed. Individual South Sea Islander peoples excelled in all sorts of areas: politics, sport, arts, religion and education. At this time, in the mid to late 1990s, by the time I was leaving this role, the sociologist in me knew that the best chance for everyone is the removal of barriers and creating opportunities for equal participation in society. But the psychologist in me, all that psychology training, led me to be fascinated in the resilience of some individuals despite their circumstances. Many years later, when I finally decided to undertake a PhD in criminology and to become a criminologist, my research developed into a focus on those who take this unexpected pathway, that show resilience in the face of adversity. I'm most interested in those who have predicted poor outcomes, and that their histories should suggest that their futures aren't too bright and that they overcome these circumstances. While today I've been talking about the history of my early work with different cultural groups, I feel it important to acknowledge that this has never been the focus of my academic research. One thing we can do as a society going forward is to intentionally create space for the voices and research of and by people of those cultural groups that have previously been marginalised, that have the poorest outcomes and highest overrepresentation within our criminal justice system. I hope that some of you here today and the members of the Committee of Management can work with me towards achieving this goal. The challenges we are facing now are not new, and they've been long on the radar of criminologists. As noted by Decker and Saar in the volume on Australian and New Zealand criminology, they stated, a little dig into the digitised archives of the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Criminology, the academic journal published by ANZSOC, unearthed that David Biles pointed out in 1969 that it's well known that Aborigines are grossly overrepresented in the prison populations of all Australian states. That was in 1969. Then 2 years later, New Zealander John Robson similarly argued that Maori offenders constituted the heart of our penal problem, and that there was a call for social action on a national scale in 1971. We all know that these early calls for social reform at a national level have not been fully realised in either Australia or New Zealand, but changes have been made and there are many good people doing good work. Some are studying processes and outcomes to build a strong evidence base, while others take an advocacy approach to create reform. While addressing the marginalisation and poor life outcomes of cultural groups affected by colonisation in Australia and New Zealand, it is an important focus for criminology, and it is important to acknowledge that beyond this, criminology is a very broad church. We have people from a broad range of disciplinary backgrounds doing important work on a broad range of topics. One only has to peruse the annual conference program or the contents of the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Criminology to get a sense of the diversity of our collective work. Today is an opportunity to celebrate the establishment of our professional body and reflect on the many contributions that have been made to the development of criminology in Australia and New Zealand. A central tenet of all social science is that an understanding of the present is predicated upon an appreciation of the past, something that applies equally well to the study of criminology as a discipline. When listening to the histories of Australian and New Zealand criminology today, we will not necessarily discover a unifying thesis or a convergence of accounts, but rather we will create an anthology of multiple perspectives and arguments about the major issues, debates, controversies, and determinants of the development and rise of criminology in Australia and New Zealand. By recording this event today and making it available to all, it is our hope that it will enhance Australia and New Zealand's criminologists' appreciation of the history of their discipline and also serve as a useful teaching and professional development resource for both undergraduate and postgraduate students. Indeed, as today's program shows, many of the professional issues and academic debates that beset the discipline today have considerable lineage. Our primary aim, however, is to make the history of Australian and New Zealand criminology accessible to future generations who may use its lessons to help shape continuing generations of Australian and New Zealand criminology. Before handing over to Russell, I would like to acknowledge some of the people who have made this event possible. Firstly, I would like to thank ANZSOC for funding this event today and supporting the attendance and recording of this today's proceedings. I'd like to thank the Melbourne School of Design for the use of the room and the terrace today in which we're meeting, and also Simply Sensational Catering for providing us with the fabulous lunch we're about to have. I would also like to thank Imagine Action and Denby Smith, our cameraman, for filming the event, and the University of Melbourne for giving permission to film on campus. An edited extract of the video for today will be shown at the opening of the conference of the ANZSOC conference in Canberra this year in December, and the full video will be made available online later in the year. I would also like to thank the University of Melbourne Archives for the photo that appears on the program today of the Babel building, and our thanks also go to Palgrave Macmillan for their handbook of Australian and New Zealand criminology, which we'll hear more about today. Finally, but by definitely no means least, I would like to thank Russell Smith for the organisation of this event. All that you see here today has been through the design and hard work of Russell. Russell will not be a stranger to anyone in the room, but I will briefly cover his biography. He's been a member of thank you. He has been a member of ANZSOC since 1981, at which time he was the Barry Medalist. He was the public officer from 2001 to 2012. He was the ANZSOC Secretary from 2003 to 2005, Vice President from 2005 to 2009, and President from 2009 to 2012. In addition to that, in 2016, Russell was made a Fellow of ANZSOC, and very luckily for me and the Committee of Management, he continues to assist us in day-to-day business of the Society as our organisational memory and also the Honorary Historian of the Society. Please join me in giving Dr. Russell Smith a warm welcome to the lectern to explain more about how this event will run and the history of ANZSOC.
Welcome to 1967. I scoured my wardrobe and came up with my 1967 tie, which I seem to recall I wore when I went to a 12-year-old's birthday party. And I asked each of you to produce a 1967 picture, and some unfortunately were unable to do so, not yet being born, but apart from that. It's quite difficult to decide how to celebrate events, but we've chosen the first meeting because I think that's probably the most fundamental milestone. The ANZSOC committee decided to go with this idea of trying to recreate the event in the same room, and ideally we would have been in the old Babel building, which you can see on the cover of the program here, which is still there, renovated and no longer containing the old lecture theatres which I attended when Ian Leader-Elliott taught me criminal law in 1974, I think it was. Deirdre Gregg taught me various criminology subjects. Dennis, I think, taught me how to use statistics. It was the most uncomfortable lecture theatre in the whole university, with like one of the old prison chapels with little wooden boxes that you had to sit in, which were interminably uncomfortable. Anyhow, so we're here today in the reconstructed Japanese room. I'll just tell you a little bit about the room because it's got some interesting features. That the idea was conceived in 1963 by Professor Shigeru Yura, and Peter, our Japanese expert, will be able to correct my pronunciation. But he was working in the School of Architecture at the time and decided to create this room in contemporary Japanese interior design. Yura came to Australia in 1961 to work on the Japanese ambassador's residence in Canberra. He was also responsible for the Japanese War Cemetery at Cowra in 1964. This room's based on a domestic Shonzukiri style of authentic 17th century housing, and is considered one of the most authentic examples of this style in Australia. The room opens onto a spacious rooftop terrace out here, and I'll just mention that we probably shouldn't go into this part of the terrace, which has got an alarmed door, but you can wander outside into the main terrace if you would like to. The terrace reimagines Yura's Japanese garden that graced the north entrance of the former School of Architecture in the Babel building. Notable features include the hand-painted sliding doors by Japanese artist Ken Jiro, panelled Japanese cedar ceiling and modular timber furniture designed by Matsumura Katsuo, woven silk wallpaper containing gold thread sourced from the Tatsumura Textile Company in Osaka, and in keeping with Japanese tradition, the room was constructed without using nails at all. Mark Finane, when he was researching his book on J.V. Barrie, discovered that the original meeting was held in the Japanese room and cost $16 at the time as rental. Intriguing. That was in the new currency, by the way, which was just changed in 1966. The room charge for today was $1,700. In 1962, the average weekly wage was $49.40. In 2017, it's $1,179. So the hiring charge in 1967 was 32.4% of the average wage, and it's now 144%. Instead of having Sir John Barry's recollections, we're going to have some observations by John Myrtle, who worked with Mark Finane on this book, The History of J.V. Barrie. And I might, just before John comes up, mention what Mark Finane said about John. said this book would not exist without the prompting and assistance well beyond the call of duty of John Myrtle. From his position at the Australian Institute of Criminology, John had developed a unique perspective on the contribution made by Sir John to the development of criminology in Australia. John facilitated my introduction to the Barry family at a time when they had decided that a biography might be welcome. His bibliographic and research skills, not to speak of his formidable network of contacts in the criminal justice field, have been critical to the development of the large database of materials that have formed around the Barry project. More than this, his acute familiarity with many aspects of 20th century Australian history, including labour history, the history of civil liberties and criminology, made him the indispensable assistant and critic. So without further ado, I'll ask John to start us off with some observations about Barry's role in the 1967 meeting.
Well, Russell, thank you for that very extravagant introduction. Today, as Russell has said, I'll be speaking about Sir John Barry and his role in the establishment of the Australian and New Zealand Society of Criminology. Firstly, I would like to thank the Society for inviting me to this 50th anniversary commemoration and for providing the opportunity for me to contribute to today's program. And as Russell has just said, as background, I was employed for 17 years as a librarian for the Australian Institute of Criminology. And following my public sector retirement, I worked as research assistant for Professor Mark Finnane's biography of Sir John Barry, published by the University of New South Wales Press in 2007. Now, some of you may not be familiar with Sir John Barry's connection with the University of Melbourne. In addition to providing details of that connection, I'll also outline biographical information to explain his seminal influence on Australian criminology. John Vincent Barry was born in Albury in 1903 and was educated by the Christian Brothers at St Patrick's College in Goulburn, New South Wales. He came to Melbourne in 1921 and was engaged as an article clerk with the solicitors Luke Murphy and Co. He was required to attend law lectures held under the auspices of the University of Melbourne. Many years later, in 1951, the university's council approved the creation of a Department of Criminology, and Barry, now a judge of the Victorian Supreme Court, was appointed to the new Board of Studies in Criminology, and subsequently he was elected as its chairman. And Barry's involvement in this unique institutional development steered the direction for the rest of his life. In March 1969, at a graduation ceremony at the university's Wilson Hall, the degree of Doctor of Laws was conferred on Sir John Barry for his for the contribution to legal and criminological scholarship made by his book Alexander McConaughey of Norfolk Island. And after Barry's death, the Sir John Barry Memorial Lecture was endowed at the University of Melbourne, with this year marking the lecture's 45th anniversary. So today I'll be discussing the role of Barry and the staff of the Melbourne Department of Criminology in the formation of the Society. In 1967, David Byles and his colleagues decided to form an Australian Society of Criminology. In Byles' words, and I'll quote here, "I recall Stan Johnston and I walking from the university to the Supreme Court to ask Sir John Barry if he would accept the position of President. He agreed on condition that it would be clearly understood that he had not sought the position." And as we know, in October, the university criminologists decided to follow up this approach and organised a public meeting to initiate the society. Now, some may say that in 1967, when this organising group from the university was planning for the establishment of a national criminology society, it would be inevitable that they'd ask the chairman of the university's Board of Studies in Criminology, who was also senior puisne judge of the Supreme Court and chairman of Victoria's Adult Parole Board, to be the founding head of the new society. However, I would argue that this request to Barry was more than just recognition of his role locally in Victoria and at the university. Above all, I suggest that it was recognition of Barry's preeminent role in Australian criminology and an acknowledgement of his agitation over many years for the establishment of just such a national society. In 1955, Barry undertook an extensive overseas study tour, much of it in the United States. In the second part of that tour, he headed the Australian delegation for the first UN Congress on the Prevention of Crime and Treatment of Offenders, held in Geneva. And later in London, he attended the International Congress for Criminology, organised by the International Society of Criminology. He became a member of the International Society, and in 1960 he was appointed to be the Society's national delegate in Australia. In October of that year, Barry received a circular from the International Society for Criminology emphasising the importance of national delegates intensifying their efforts in favour of criminology in their country. Specifically, the circular indicated that the best solution would consist of the immediate creation of a National Society of Criminology, and also mentioned two initiatives worthy of recommendation for national societies, namely creation of a National Prize for Criminology and organisation of national congresses of criminology. Now, this was a very ambitious agenda for a country like Australia, with so few engaged in the discipline. And even before receiving this circular, earlier in 1960, Barry had written to Jean Pinatel, who was Secretary General of the International Society for Criminology, lamenting his inability to interest colleagues in an Australian Society of Criminology. I quote, "I made efforts some time ago to have established a non-governmental Australian Association for the Advancement of Criminology, but I could not then gain sufficient support. I shall renew my efforts this year, and I hope now for greater success." Now, having in mind these communications with the International Society, a letter from Alan Bartholomew to Mr. Justice Barry in December 1960 is worthy of note. In 1960, Bartholomew had been recruited from the English Prison Service to be psychiatrist superintendent of Pentry Prison here in Melbourne. In his work in Melbourne, participating in parole board matters and lecturing part-time in the university's Department of Criminology brought him into regular contact with Barry. Barry was writing at the end of his first year in Melbourne. "With regards to your plans to initiate moves towards the formation of an Australian Association for the Advancement of Criminal Science, I can say at once that my first impression is that it's a good idea. However, in setting out some of my ideas on the subject, I become more and more concerned as to exactly how it would work." Bartholomew suggested that such an association could organise a congress, perhaps every 3 years or so. If such an idea was envisaged, could not the Australian Association be made the Australasian Association, thus bringing in New Zealand and the administration in New Guinea? Now, while Bartholomew was suggesting forming an Australasian Association, it's noteworthy that communications advertising the founding October meeting in 1967 specified establishment of an Australian society, with no mention of the New Zealand connection. It is recorded in the proceedings of the meeting that after the motion to create a Society of Criminology had been moved and accepted, discussion followed, leading to a decision to expand the title of the society to reflect New Zealand membership, with this decision being provisional upon a suitable response coming from this country. However, Sir John Barry, just elected as president of the new society, did not wait for a suitable response. At the meeting, he went ahead and nominated his friend John Robson as New Zealand's representative for the executive. Now, Dr. John Lochiel Robson was a significant figure in New Zealand criminology and legal affairs. He was Secretary for Justice from 1960 to 1970 and later was instrumental in the establishment of the Institute of Criminology at the Victoria University of Wellington. In his memoirs, Robson spoke of his friendship with Barry, who he had first met at the Second UN Congress for the Prevention of Crime and Treatment of Offenders, held in London in 1960. They had corresponded prior to that Congress, but a more regular correspondence and close friendship developed during the 1960s. In June 1967, Barry had alerted Robson of moves to form a criminology society, writing with some ambition, You are already aware of the move for an Australian Society of Criminology, in which Dr. Bartholomew is active. If it can be got off the ground, I think the planning should envisage that it will emerge in a Pacific Society of Criminology, with a view to including Asian countries, including Japan and the Philippines. And the day after the inaugural October meeting, Sir John Barry again wrote to Robson, telling him that the Australian and New Zealand Society of Criminology had been formed and advising him, in expectation of your consent, you were unanimously chosen as a New Zealand member of the executive. I do hope you'll endorse this action by agreeing to be a member of the executive. Now, Barry need not have worried because Robson quickly responded to the news of his nomination. I'm certainly willing to serve as a New Zealand member of the executive and accept office willingly. And Robson was enthusiastic about his new role, later reporting to Barry that he had persuaded D.F. Mackenzie, Director of Research in the Justice Department, to act as New Zealand correspondent for the Society's journal. After Barry's death in November 1969, John Robson paid tribute to his friend. We were robbed of a truly outstanding character. Sir John's intellectual contribution was, of course, profound and extensive. His friends in many lands will remember him for his outstanding personal qualities, his moral courage, his forthrightness, his humanity grounded in realism stood out for all to see. On this occasion of the 50th anniversary, it seems worth recalling and commending Barry's vision of a Pacific society, including Asian membership, as an indication once again of the originality and prescience, in this respect, well ahead of his time. Thank you.
I commend you, Dr. McGee and Dr. Smith, and all those who have had the creativity, initiative and commitment to bring about this happy and significant event, so appropriately held in the place of the origin of the Society, the Japanese Room, then in the Babel building on this campus, and on its 50th anniversary. I also speak of wig, gown and stethoscope, personified by Sir John Barry, Professor Norval Morris and Dr. Alan Bartholomew. Two of the three were present at the birth of the Department of Criminology at the University of Melbourne in March 1951, Sir John Barry and Dr. Norval Morris, as he then was, and had been instrumental in its formation. Two of the three, Sir John and Dr. Bartholomew, were present at the birth of the Society on this place in 1967. Professor Morris was then Dean of the Chicago Law School, but I'm sure was present here in spirit. There is thus a cadence that we are all here today, 50 years on, celebrating the values that each of those three embodied. As John has rehearsed splendidly, Sir John Barry was a distinguished Justice of the Supreme Court of Victoria who was not confined to the courts of law, but whose creative mind and social responsibility led him to criminology and its associated spheres. I rather speak of Sir John only in the tripartite context of the title wig, gown and stethoscope. Sir John was chairman of the Board of Studies for nearly 40 years, until his death in 1969. In contrast, Norval's period as Secretary of the Department from 1951, including as Associate Professor of Criminology, ran to the end of 1958, when he went to Adelaide to be the Dean of the Faculty of Law and ultimately to the Chicago Law School, where he remained until his death in 2004. In Mark Vernane's biography, he wrote, "Morris's and Barry's collaboration was critical to the growth of the department in its early years. In spite of the 20-year age gap, the two met on equal intellectual terms. Morris, articulate, confident and ambitious, brought to the partnership an intensive research training from his PhD supervisor Mannheim in London. Barry brought the long experience of working in the criminal law." Upon Norval's death, John Monaghan, Professor of Law, Psychology and Legal Medicine at the University of Virginia Law School, gave Norval this profound compliment. "An entire cohort of criminal lawyers and criminologists can aptly and proudly be called the children of Norval." Most appropriately, today we commence in 1967. I have stepped back a little earlier to 1951 to signify a founding personal relationship and to signify the strength and benefit of such a relationship. To 1967. Sir John being the wig and Norval Morris being the gown, Dr. Bartholomew was the stethoscope. The minutes of the inaugural meeting of the Society record that Dr. Alan Bartholomew was present. Following the election of the Executive Committee, at which Sir John was elected President, the meeting notes that it was given a report by Dr. Bartholomew on preliminary discussions he has had regarding the presentation of a journal, as John has referred. It was characteristic of Dr. Bartholomew that he would be proactive and offer to do the work. He was not only a foundation member of the Society and foundation editor of the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Criminology in 1968 to 1980. In time he became Vice President of the Society and ultimately its President in 1978 and 1979. Alan had undertaken his medical studies at the University of London, King's College and Westminster Hospital, and his psychiatric training at Maudsley. He came to Melbourne with his family in 1959 and became psychiatrist superintendent of Pentridge Prison and a forensic psychiatrist. He was a skilled and ethical psychiatrist who constantly appeared as an expert witness in the courts. He provided reports and gave evidence in many cases in the Supreme Court. He never wrote or said an unnecessary word, an admirable quality of relevance for a judge, and one which concentrated the minds of the parties. I knew when a report of his was tendered, or when he gave evidence, that I could trust it, whether or not I accepted his conclusions. There is no higher praise from a judge. Alan died, as you have said, Russell, after a sad decade of ill health. Alan was a person of strong flavour and was idiosyncratic. It was a paradox for a writer so clear and so accessible that his major text was titled Psychiatry, the Criminal Law and Corrections, an Exercise in Sciolism. Its thesis was that psychiatry had a limited role in the courts, but a major role in corrections. As you appreciate, every punter knows what sciolism means. Before I became a judge, Alan and I spent some long nights together considering sciolism and ended up, well, almost anywhere. But that is a story for another day. So, Dr. McGee and Dr. Smith, I commend you both most warmly for this auspicious and happy occasion, and I wish you and the Society well in your significant work.
Now I'm going to ask Professor Duncan Chappell, who's also a fellow of the Society and was one of the founding members and also an assistant editor of the journal, to come and give us some recollections about the meeting.
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to disabuse the notion that I can give you a weather report. I didn't have an internet connection in those days to consult, and even if I Googled it, I suppose I could probably have come up with one, but I hope I can make one or two reflections on what was a very memorable event. But I'd first like to thank the Society very warmly for the invitation to attend today's lunch and session and the events here. And it's an occasion for me, at least, of both joy and happy memories, and also, of course, of some sadness and reflection on many of the friends, the colleagues who have gone through the experience of the foundations of criminology in this country and are no longer still with us. In fact, those of us who were at that meeting in 1967 here in the former Japanese room are a small band of survivors, and I guess we are fortunate in a way to be here. I think I was 28 at the time, and certainly from the photograph that somehow Russell has been able to obtain, I had a lot more hair in those days than I recall. I also have only, I must admit, very dim recollections of the actual day itself, but I had an earlier dispute with David Biles about whether I was even here at all. Now, David insisted that I wasn't for a long time, and it wasn't until I assume he was able to find his own minutes of the meeting that he was able to see that I was recorded as a attendee. We had quite a lot of jocular reflections on that. But it's very sad, as Russell has said, and Tara, that David is not with us today. I spent many happy years with him at the Australian Institute of Criminology, where he was the deputy director. He made many, many contributions to the field of criminology. The one I recall, though, with the greatest warmth was when the two of us were in Beijing at a very formal dinner, and the hosts produced a rice edifice that was white, bright white, and about probably a metre or so high. And on this rice edifice was some large black objects. And on closer inspection, it was clear that they were, in fact, barbecued scorpions. And I said to David, David, one of the things that a deputy always does is to taste the food before anyone else, and would you mind if just trying this scorpion? And he did. I had, to his internal credit, so I have always remembered that event with great warmth, and I pay tribute to David today in that way. But I came to the meeting in 1967 with three of us from Sydney. Professor Ken Shapwell, who was the then Dean of the Law School at Sydney, and also who was the Foundation Director of the New South Wales or University of Sydney Institute of Criminology. And in fact, we celebrated our 50th last year, and I was present at that as well. So I suppose a double celebration in a way. But Ken came, and also Bob Ralston, who was a senior lecturer in criminal law and with whom I shared the teaching load at the University of Sydney at the law school at the time in criminal law. So there were three of us here, and there may have been others from New South Wales. I'm not absolutely sure of that, but we flew down in an Electra 4-engine aircraft. I remember that since one of the other things over the years I've always been very fond of flying, and had the privilege of flying for a while when I was at the Cambridge Air Squadron in the United Kingdom. And I noted that it was an Electra, and I think it was a bumpy trip, so the weather must have perhaps been a little bit off But anyway, and we were paid to come down here. The Ken had this, what was called the Law School Notes Fund, which all the students were obliged to buy their own notes at the time. We didn't have many texts. And they produced a very nice source of revenue for events like this. So we were all able to come. And I think we must have stayed the night, because after the meeting there was definitely, we were repaired to the local hostelry. And I do record that one of the contextual events was that in 1966, that horrible swill, the 6 o'clock swill, ended. So we didn't have to line up the 10 or so beers to consume them. We had a civilised amount of time to do it. So even though I don't remember very much about the actual meeting itself, I thought it might be just a little interesting to reflect on some of the contextual things that were going on at the time. In addition to the end of the 6 o'clock swill in 1966, in 67 it was the year, of course, at which we had our referendum to establish that our first inhabitants, the indigenous people of this country, would be recognised as citizens. And it was momentous in that way. It was momentous too because in the criminological sense, I suppose the largest issue by far was that of the of capital punishment. And in February of 1967, just a few months, of course, before this meeting here took place, Ronald Ryan was hanged in Pentridge Prison, and it had a profound impact not only on the nation itself, but also on those who'd had to preside at that execution, which included Alan Bartholomew. And Alan would often go back and recall these events over some of the long sessions that we had to discuss these things. And Alan himself had to actually pronounce Ronald Ryan dead, a chore that he obviously was horrified by. And I think it was the end, it fortunately was the end of the use of capital punishment, but at that time we didn't have the foresight to see that was so. There was also a campaign, an active one, to try and prevent whipping or corporal punishment as one of those punishments that was available at the time. And indeed, when I think of the first editorial comments, I seem to recall I might have written it at the time, was about corporal punishment and its abolition. So there were obviously rather different days from now in that context. Of course, one of the other things that we are much consumed about at the moment is the referendum or the survey, whatever one wants to call it, on same-sex marriage. But at the time in the criminal law reform area, one of the hot issues was the reform of the law concerning homosexual acts and also on abortion. Both of those were very active matters for public debate and comment. And in the terms of finding out about public attitudes, Paul Wilson and I had a grants, one from the Nuffield Foundation and one from the ARC at the time, to actually survey national approaches to and beliefs about law reform in these areas. And here we are at the moment concerned about whether or not we should recognise same-sex marriages. But in those in 1967, only 20% of our survey group agreed with the statement that consensual acts of homosexuality between adults in private should not be a crime. So roughly 80% of the population believe that we should continue to use the criminal law to punish people who engaged in these acts. Obviously there's been a profound shift over the years in that whole practice. The other matter which I think probably we should recall was that 1967, for anyone who was under the age of 25, you faced the prospect of possibly being balloted in to go and serve in Vietnam as a soldier or whatever in the military. and very much the whole notion of protest that was occurring at that time on campuses and elsewhere was pervade in some of the discussion and some of the things that occurred within the context of the meeting in the Japanese room. Well, it was in fact also the time that I became involved with the journal, and at a separate meeting, and I had originally thought it was at this meeting, the first meeting of the society. It was an executive meeting in December, I'm reminded, of the same year, that Alan, Bartholomew and I were invited to attend the meeting of the executive committee of the society here in Melbourne, and we were appointed, Alan as editor and I was appointed as the assistant editor of the journal. And for the next year or so I used to regularly commute down here to spend time with Alan as we published the first editions of the journal. The journal was published by Southdown Press, which was a special arrangement that Alan had somehow negotiated with them. Southdown Press was best known for publishing Truth, a well-known journal which Rupert Murdoch would have blushed at, I think. But it was, anyway, it was a document of some notoriety, but they published our journal. Quite a long time, I can't remember how many years, but they did a very good job. Well, I think enough of my recollections on this, but I don't anticipate anyway being here to celebrate the 100th anniversary, but I do, I'm sure that there will be many around this table who will be there, and I wish both them and the society very much progress and good things for the next 50 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. And as we're listening to the people who've already spoken, just really came to me what's at stake here. And what I mean by that is, what's it all about? And ultimately it's all about human beings and lives and hope and forgiveness and order in society. So many things that are really at stake in this whole area of justice and law and human beings. So it's just a privilege to be part of that in some small way at this meeting today. It was just mentioned that in early 1963 I was appointed a full-time chaplain to juvenile justice in Victoria, and it was the first such appointment, as far as I know, and it was made by the Social Welfare Department of Victoria. And I was thinking, why was I asked to do this job as a chaplain, a full-time chaplain in this area? And it was really because I'd had a number of years had been a priest in one of the sort of tougher areas of Melbourne, West Heidelberg, which was a housing commission area and had a sort of a reputation of being a pretty tough place. And whether that was fair is another question. But I was working in that parish and mixing with all sorts of people, many of whom were great people, some of the finest people I've ever had the pleasure of knowing. And so I had worked there for a number of years, and the Archbishop of Melbourne at the time just thought that it would be appropriate to offer me to serve in this area. And so that's how it came about. And at the same time that I was appointed, several other chaplains, full-time chaplains, were appointed to, one an Anglican and another Protestant. Salvation Army had some role in the area too, but didn't declare themselves so much in the area of criminology, but they were active and have been ever since. And so they're the sort of things that come to mind. And so what was it about? The interesting thing was that when I was appointed, I was given no instructions as to what you were supposed to do, so it really came into us all to work out the best way we thought we could serve people and the community, and just do it without any predecessors to show us the way. So we just had to do what we thought was right and common sense, and that's how we tried to get started. In the early, so 1963 was my appointment, and this is a number of years before the Department of Criminology came into existence, and so what was the best way to sort of approach the whole thing was to say, how do we approach it? And the thing was to say, well, the first thing is to get to know people in this field, parents and children, as well as the people who are working in the field. And so that's how we sort of started to think about it in that sort of framework. And so we started to talk to people who were in fact working in areas, some of the tougher areas of Melbourne or Victoria, and to see what they thought about what was needed at the community at the time. And one thing that was sort of coming out pretty clearly is that there hadn't been much consideration from the government level about some of the big issues that were involved, and so even to just be part of a contribution of ideas and thoughts about what's happening in the society, especially in the more tougher areas of Melbourne, it was important that we should get in that sort of direction. So I was appointed, and the place we never had, by the way, had no introduction from the Social Welfare Department, which was the organisation that I was somehow or other connected with. We tried to think about how what are the problems? What are the problems in society that are causing us great concern? And in this particular context, what was happening is that there are a lot of young people who were getting into trouble with the police, and the police and lawyers to some lesser extent, and so that was the sort of beginning. How do we talk to those people? And we did our best to speak with a lot of people who were in the law field at the time, and the police, and so that's how we sort of approached in an indirect sort of a way. And so the place we went to work in those days in 1963, it was a place called Tirana, and still a fairly familiar name, not for the best of reasons in more recent times, because Tirana is going through a pretty rough time, so what was happening there was it was a place for boys roughly between the ages of about 14 and 17, and the way kids got there was by going to prison, going to court, and being sentenced by magistrates, and then what happened afterwards then was up to ourselves as chaplains to see how we could help them and work with others in the field, social workers and so on, to help what was beginning as a bad thing in their lives turn out to be not so bad, and with some hope. And so that was how we sort of approached it, and there was a lot of good in that too. At the same time, what was happening in the courts was very important, because the children's court was very important and worked closely with the government in determining what was the best action to take in the future for these youngsters and their families. And so that's what we started to do, and I certainly spent a fair bit of time visiting families that came, where these kids came from, and then to go back to the court situation itself, we thought that the magistrates or the judges, the magistrates in most cases were children's court magistrates, what was their view about it all? And I must say, I always thought there was a real sort of fairness about the way the magistrates approached these kids that came before them. And so the options that the magistrates had were fairly simple. The options were, do you sentence these kids to some sort of imprisonment, or is there some other way of approaching these youngsters when they've got into trouble like this? What about the future of them for these kids? What about their future? And they were all very, very important questions, and it was a task of everybody in the field at the time to try and find some sensible way of answering some of those sort of questions. At that time, there were a number of places apart from Tirana, which is in Parkville. Another way of approaching it was to get the youngsters placed in places other than Tirana, and there were places like Malmesbury and Langakelkel. Some of them have been used fairly recently. And there were other places that various churches were involved with. The Salvation Army had a place out in Bayswater. Catholics had places like St Vincent de Paul's Orphanage in South Melbourne. Those sort of places were there also as an alternative ways of dealing with these kids. And so that's how it sort of started to develop and go on from there. One of the things that we think about these days is what's the best way to handle situations that haven't been familiar places for us in the past. And what I'm referring to particularly now is that juvenile justice is a tricky subject, and I had much of my time in this field was in juvenile justice, but I also had experience with prison, senior prison. Sort of, a lot of you remember a famous name, Father Brosnan, a great character who was a known figure in all sorts of ways, and he was one of the big names in prison chaplaincy, as Peter Norton, who is today, also was. So what are we trying to do with these kids? It was to find ways to give them a chance to come to terms with what's happening in their lives. And so we tried to do that. And there were a couple of oddities in what was happening. One was that when the kids were going to court, often there was uncertainty in the minds of the magistrates as to what was the best thing to do. And one of the things was that one of the options that they had was to give youngsters a fixed sentence, or to make them create then a situation of wards of the state. And sometimes youngsters who really had done very little wrong, but were unable to find a family they could live with, and those youngsters became, sometimes when they just made wards of the state with no fixed sentence. And that was a very interesting situation. And then so when youngsters, after they say they might have been, were given sentences, and they were often in the same section of Tirana,
as kids who were for major crime. And that was all seemed to be strange, odd to us. And some of us say you could have a kid who was in there for really serious crime and in the same room or same cell as kids who've done nothing wrong at all. And that was a very odd sort of situation. And we tried very much to talk about that with the authorities. There was a system of social workers working in places like Tirana, and that was a very good thing to have. And they also made a contribution in the courts for decision making about their future. One of the things that's taking place today is that our government leaders are playing a sort of a double game. A double game being that they're sort of saying how they're going to be tough on crime, and every time there's an election they're going to be tough on crime and longer sentences and tougher on the parole board meeting and so on and so forth. And that's been, we're seeing that as a move away from seeing young people as being really in need of help and strengthening and options into justice. And so we're talking today at, say, the Premier talking just the last week or so about building a prison for youngsters in Werribee for about 250 people. It was an extraordinary situation. And we say, well, there's only, at this moment, there's about 150 youngsters in custodial sentences at the moment. If we're going to pay 250 kids, it's doubling the number of youngsters that are in fact in courts and in prison. And it's sort of a strange thing that it's almost saying we want the media to get off our backs, and the media to sort of say, well, the wonderful things we're doing to create safe places for people to live. And so that's one of the big things that is really happening and causing us a lot of great concern. So anyway, look, there's some of the thoughts that have come to my mind, that there are so many good things being done in recent times, and I'm sure the contribution of this organisation that we're about today, of Criminology, it's got a very serious part to play. So thanks for your attention. Thank you.
This has taken us from the 60s into the 70s, and we've got the first four groups of people in the first four group who are going to talk about life in the 70s in criminology and the society. And I'm going to welcome, first of all, Emeritus Fellow Ian Leader Elliott, who, as I mentioned, had the torments of teaching me in the 70s. We decided not only to invite presidents and the people from the first meeting, but also some who were the very earliest members of the society and involved in looking at criminal law and criminology from the earliest times, and Ian's one of those. He was a staff member at the Melbourne Law School and a member from the first register of members that I've got, which takes us back to the earliest times. So would you welcome Ian, please?
Thank you, Russell, for those kind words. I'm delighted by the invitation and grateful for the opportunity to say a few words about my memory of the, I'm afraid I have to say it, the 1960s, because I am slightly chronologically displaced in this program. I hope you'll forgive me that. What I have to say has to do with not the 1970s, but the preceding decade. And Duncan has already covered some part of what I have to say, but that's the way it is when you start to reminisce. And I'll try to cut my cloth accordingly. I begin with the first issue of the Journal, and in 1968. And notable from my point of view is the concern expressed in correspondence, articles, and editorials by Alan Bartholomew with the subjects of corporal and capital punishment. For, of course, has been pointed out already, the anniversary of the founding of the Society coincides with another anniversary, the execution of Ronald Ryan, the last person executed in Australia, in February 1967 for killing prison warder George Hudson during an escape. Corporal punishment was perhaps a more surprising inclusion in the first issue of the journal, for punishment for whipping was last inflicted in 1958, in another case involving a prison escape, when William Taylor and Robert O'Meally were whipped for injuries inflicted on another prison warder, Robert Davis. Notable too in that case the fact that one of the few occasions when Norval Morris donned his wig and appeared in an appeal court on behalf of Robert O'Meally, arguing that, strangely, corporal punishment was no longer constitutionally possible in Victoria. The argument was brave, but it failed. He also argued it was inefficacious and inappropriately cruel. That argument failed as well, and of course those two men, Taylor and O'Meally, were indeed flogged for the injuries they inflicted on the warder. But it was appropriate to talk about corporal punishment, the 1968 issue, because in 1966, in what appears to have been a very carefully staged test of the law, County Court Judge Trevor Rapke sought an expert opinion from Alan Bartholomew, Stanley Johnson, then of course head of the Board of Studies in Criminology, and Norval Morris, who was then a corresponding member of the journal. Norval was by then, of course, at the Law School, University of Chicago. All three argued in different tones of voice that corporal punishment was inefficacious, inappropriately cruel and unworkable, and Judge Rapke, to no one's surprise, decided that Kevin Douglas, the robber in question, should not be whipped. And I choose corporal and capital punishment as the subjects for talking about because they link with my own small role in the Society and my early mentors, who were John Barry and Norval Morris, both of whom were passionate opponents of capital punishment and corporal punishment. So I'll begin with a personal memory. I recall with peculiar clarity February morning when Ronald Ryan was hanged, and I was a tutor in the law school, 1967, and incidentally a student in the criminology school with Deirdre Gregg, I may say, as one of my lecturers, Stanley as another, and David Biles, neither of whom, of course, can be here for one reason or another today. And so I was waiting there outside Pentridge Prison with other demonstrators, having addressed meetings against capital punishment, solicited signatures against capital punishment, and finally being there, as it were, for the last act. Later that year, I went to Chicago as a Commonwealth Fellow, which was one of the scholarships that Zelman Cowan, Dean of the Law School, then had effectively in his gift. And I spent a tumultuous year as a student of Norval Morris, his courses in criminology and penology. He was foremost among the inspiring teachers I had at Chicago in 1967, 1968 when I was there. Also, happily, Gordon Hawkins, whom I recall particularly for his elegance and wit, was a visiting scholar. He and Norval were then engaged in an ebullient collaboration on what was to become the Honest Politician's Guide to Crime Control. Franklin Zimring, another recent Chicago graduate, had just commenced his pioneering work on gun control. These were 1967-68. Were exciting years to be in Chicago. The Vietnam War was progressing to an eventual American defeat and protests at home. Martin Luther King was assassinated. I was living with my then wife and two children on the south side, which erupted in flames when, I'm sure it must be men, set fire to the furniture in their apartments kind of incendiary expression of grief at that assassination. I remember the days following, the footpaths covered with burnt-out furniture rescued from those apartments. Inside, Robert Kennedy was, of course, assassinated in 1968, and the year culminated in the Democratic National Convention, where Mayor Daley came very close to declaring martial law. So there were dangerous and exciting times of ferment in Chicago. Inside the academy, it was, however, a time for optimism. Norval Morris, as head of the Centre for Studies in Criminal Justice, was in command of munificent Ford Foundation monies for studying capital punishment, deterrence, prison, among other topics. 1967-68 was the first year in anyone's memory in which no one was executed in the United States. A moratorium which was to last for 10 years before executions began again and mounted steadily in numbers and are still, of course, continuing. Also forgotten now are the aspirations for a more humane and effective criminal law in President Johnson's Commission for Law Enforcement and the Administration of Justice. They'd published a vision report, The Challenge of Crime in a Free Society. So it was, in those years, a time of ferment and optimism. I returned to Melbourne Law School as a lecturer at the end of 1968 when I joined the Society, which is how I come to appear in that first list. My interest then and now is in what Mark Finane has called classical criminology as distinct from neoclassical. Both those terms, I gather, are now in the remote past, but my concern was always what conduct should be criminally punishable and with what degree of severity, rather than with the constitution of the criminal or the nature of influences that made people criminal or those factors. Back in Melbourne in those days, I remember optimism was focused on an activist Victorian Supreme Court rather than a then recalcitrant legislature. The Douglas case, in which Judge Rapke effectively put an end to flogging as a penalty, was followed in 1969 by the Menhennet ruling in the Davidson case, which effectively put an end to prosecution for termination of pregnancy. That tradition of judicial activism actually followed on from the work of Justice John Barry in the court and Justice Lowe and some other members of the Victorian Supreme Court in a period remarkable for the citation of academic articles, particularly in Barry's judgments, but also the judgments of Justice Scholl and occasionally Justice Lowe's judgments, in which it might have been a golden age for academics in terms of citation, which may have been revived recently, but certainly in those years was highly unusual. Now, the activist decisions of the 1960s were followed indeed by legislation abolishing capital punishment, of course, in 1975 and in 1981. That had been long disused. Corporal punishment ceased to be a penalty that could be exacted. Since then, however, the legislatures in Commonwealth and state have been increasingly active. Criminal law has expanded its scope hugely. The penalties have grown ever more severe with ever less judicial control over penalties. And I'd like to end, if I may, in the remaining 2 or 3 minutes, with a kind of strange story from the 1950s, which I want to leave somewhat without reflection. It concerns a rapist, Raymond Charles Burles. And it was a bad rape, not accompanied by violent injury, but a brutal rape. And also a robbery. He was tried for robbery before Justice Barry, and the trial lasted just 1 day and he was convicted. He was tried for the rape before Justice Lowe, and the trial lasted just 1.5 days and he was convicted. Justice Lowe saved for appeal the question whether Burles where the jury should have been asked whether Burles realised his victim had not been consenting. He said, I'm not going to direct on that. You can argue that on appeal if you want. Went, and he did. Burles was then sentenced to death, the then mandatory penalty for rape. He appealed from that sentence and that decision to the Court of Criminal Appeal in Victoria, which rejected his appeal, and eventually to the High Court. Now, a couple of interesting things about this. After his appeal to the High Court failed, which upheld his conviction for rape and the death penalty, of course the sentence was commuted. He was commuted to just 6 years imprisonment. Now, there is a very strange discrepancy in terms of the way we think now between the death penalty and a mere 6 years sentence for rape. The other factor which is interesting is the case took up an issue dear to the hearts of both Justice Barry and Norval Morris. You should not be convicted of a serious crime unless the prosecution can prove that you knew the elements of the crime you're committing. And that decision and that issue was the one raised by Burles, and Norval Morris wrote on it, and it was part of the continuing preoccupation of the Victorian Supreme Court over succeeding decades. So, was the optimism of the 1960s justified? I'm far from sure, certainly not, I think, in America, but in terms of the extension of the criminal law and the severity of penalties, I think we have, as someone said during the break, we're just going round the same old circle yet again. Thank you.
Now I'm going to call upon Dennis Challenger, who was a former ANZSOC secretary many years ago and staff member of the Criminology department. And I've asked Dennis to recount some observations about life as a secretary of the society and other things that happened in the department and in Melbourne criminology in the 60s and 70s.
After the very considered presentations that you have heard, I'm afraid I'm going to just free associate a wee bit about the Criminology department and the Criminology Society in the 1970s. Unfortunately, I wasn't at the initial meeting in 1967. I was studying mathematics at Monash University for a science degree. But after graduating with that, I did join the Social Welfare Department, about which Father Mogg spoke earlier. And it was, by today's standards, a very strange department indeed. It was at one time the social welfare branch of the Chief Secretary's department, but its ambit went from children, from wards, through monitoring children's homes, to monitoring children's employment if they were under 14, to youth matters, to looking after juvenile offenders, running youth training centres, to looking after families and providing, at that time, financial support for single mothers, because the Commonwealth Government didn't believe that these women should be supported at that time. It fell upon the state to do so, but it changed along the way, as we all well know. And also, of course, it looked after prisons. And it was therefore a cornucopia of research possibilities. I joined as a research officer. There was at that time one social worker who headed up this great unit of the research and statistics part of the department. There were a couple of clerks and a typist. And somewhere in the first year or so that I was there, questions were asked in the Legislative Assembly about matters relating to reporting what was actually going on, and my little group where I worked was referred to as being one man and a dog, and I knew who the man was, and I was very concerned. However, it seemed to me, talking to some of the old hands who identified, I remember particularly cognate families, that is families in Victoria whose members were well represented across the spectrum of all those services, that there were many things that could well be done and could be informed by a little bit of research and application. And I decided as a pure scientist that I needed to get a more formal introduction to those issues. So I joined or enrolled with the Criminology department in the postgraduate diploma of Criminology. Now, Melbourne University at that time had 4 graduate diplomas. One was Criminology, the second was Social Studies, which later transmuted into social work. The third was Journalism, which eventually finished up, I think, at RMIT, and the fourth was Physical Education. Now, these 4 postgraduate diplomas were sort of fringe disciplines in the eyes of this quite traditional and conservative organisation. And it's my view that the criminologists, or the Criminology department, had a bit of a hard road to hoe, despite the support of people like Sir John Barry and Norval Morris and others. And it could be said that this was represented by the fact that while the department started off being housed in the law school, it was eventually, because of the need for more space for lawyers, moved across to the western side of Royal Parade into a terrace house, in which Deirdre Gregg occupied the downstairs front room and placed her baby in the window. For what reason I'm not quite sure, but first of the working mothers. This was wonderful. Stan Johnson sat upstairs with the balcony so that he could rally the masses, no doubt. And David Biles occupied the room at the very back of the building. Now, we new students, when we arrived, one of the first things we were told was what a good thing it would be for us to join the Society of Criminology, recently formed. And there was some discussion about whether joining would actually lead to improved marks or not. And despite that, many of us did, and we had to tender our application forms to the Foundation Secretary David Biles in the department. And I remember being a little startled when I visited with my form to submit to him, and he said, "Come to my room." And you will remember he was a long-legged man, and he bounced up the stairs of this terrace house 2 at a time at a great pace and shot straight into the door at the far end of the passageway like a rocket, leaving people with their forms in his wake. However, he of course performed that role for some time, and later on, Russell will tell you when, I also, following in his footsteps, I became secretary. I'd also become a member of the department. I also told students at the opening lectures what a good idea it would be for them to join the society. So the wheel simply goes round. Now, I think when I was secretary, which was for a number of years, in the first 15 or so years of the existence of the society, it's not unfair or inappropriate to describe the society as slightly benign. It had a couple of functions. One was the publication of the journal, and the second, at that time at least, was the annual general meeting. In between, there wasn't a great deal that went on. So I saw that I had these 2 responsibilities, one of which was supporting Alan Bartholomew in his endeavours. Now, Alan was a fine fellow and a great raconteur, and I was thinking earlier on as people were speaking, yes, what are some of the fine stories that I can tell, and I just thought I would share one with you that he used to tell about Sir John Barry, because we've talked about him. Now, I would like to tell you that I met or had some interaction with Sir John Barry, but apart from bumping into him in the lift in the Social Welfare Department building when he was going up to chair a parole board. I had no such interaction. But Alan tells the story of where he and an Australian delegation, including or probably led by Sir John, had been in some country which I cannot recall. They were leaving this country and getting on the aeroplane, and Duncan, I'm sorry that I cannot tell you what particular aeroplane it was, but Bartholomew says, I was sitting at the window looking out and we were waiting for the last passenger, Sir John, to arrive. And finally he appeared, he walked across the tarmac, he got into the plane, took his seat, and Bartholomew said, I'm still looking out the window wondering what on earth's going on, and we're waiting, to take off. And a little truck came out from the terminal and they opened the hold and took out 2 large mail bags, no doubt to accommodate for the weight of Sir John on the flight that was being taken. Alan was not greatly demanding of my services when I was secretary, although it was his wont to ring from the editorial office at Norton's pub and say, somebody needs to go down to Southdown Press with this document and you have a bicycle. And so I would collect it from him. Duncan has referred to Southdown Press, and it used to be said by many men that they bought the Truth newspaper to read the sporting section and ignored the pictures of naked women which were dotted throughout the rest of it. I believe that some of the men bought it so that they could read the salacious details of certain crimes. And the fact that sometimes these were matters that Alan himself had involvement in is perhaps purely, just serendipitous. But when you wonder why it was that Southdown Press, whose editing history was extraordinary, tabloid newspapers, why they would want to publish an academic journal, except as a helpful quid pro quo to somebody who helped them with some of their other stories, seems to be where it might be. Alan, of course, there are. No, I'm just putting aside all the stories that one might take. So might tell. The only other thing I might say about the journal is that at that particular stage of its life, I don't believe that it was as rigorously edited as it might have been. Alan was very kindly and quite a gentle editor in many respects. The other side of things, from my point of view as a secretary, related to administrative matters in the annual general meeting, and I have to say that for the most part, the office bearers, the executive of the society, was determined consensually before such things as the annual general meeting, and to the best of my knowledge, there were never any souls who put their hands up to be nominated for either secretary or treasurer at the time. So generally speaking, that went quite well, although of course there were tensions, as there are in any organisation, and rather quaintly the tensions in the society at that time seemed to be solved, or at least diffused in part, on the university squash courts, which are just behind us. And so you would get the secretary, the editor, the vice president, and the honorary secretary, who was hopeless at squash, over at the courts, taking out their angst against each other with a degree of vigour, I might say. And indeed this sporting thing extends even further, because I recall on one occasion when Greg Woods, QC from Sydney, who took over as secretary at some time, was in Melbourne, that I got a call at home to attend quickly to the Johnson residence in Kew, which had a tennis court, because the editor and the vice president and Greg Woods needed a fourth person to make up a doubles match for, once again, a very vigorous and full-blooded entertainment. I might add, because you like these things, and you've already, Russell, indicated the value of money now compared with the past, that most people in the Crim department were horrified in the 1970s when Stan Johnson paid $66,000 for a house in Kew with a tennis court. He did subsequently sell it, didn't he, Deirdre, within the last year or so for 4.65? So it was a fine. You can pop that into your comparisons, along with the comparisons of the rise in prison population. Yes, good, which you left out. Anyway, these tensions, as I say, were mostly diffused, except for one annual general meeting, and I cannot recall the finer details for the President, because I know she was keen to hear them, but basically speaking, there was a little bit of a strain, a little bit of excitement, a great deal of what I will call proxy harvesting, and a certain tenseness when the meeting came to determine the election of a new, I'm sure it was the presidency. I truly cannot remember the finer details of this, but as returning officer at the time, as the Honorary Secretary was, with my unfortunate sense of Protestant rectitude, which Duncan will recognise, I was able to declare all the proxies invalid, so that we were able to so it was only the people at the meeting who got to vote, which meant that my passage from the room was okay because the majority were going to be happy with what had happened. But that was in the past, gone by the way, has not affected the society as far as I can tell. And while those of us at that particular time were no doubt, well, certainly not thinking of what might happen to the society in 50 years' time, those of us who go back that far are well gratified to see it prospering as it does, and we commend those of you who are in whose care it is at the moment. Thank you for your time and your patience. I will resume my seat. Thank you.
Now I'd like to ask Adjunct Professor Peter Norden, who's also a Fellow of the Society, to come and speak to us. Peter's a long-term ANZSOC member, hence he's in that category of people who joined very early on, and he's going to take up the task of talking a bit about some of the pastoral things that the Society was involved in over the years, particularly in the 60s and beyond. Thank you.
In 1967, I was completing my second year matriculation and not thinking about crime very much, except when Ronald Ryan was executed in February of that year. By chance, his wife Dorothy and their three daughters lived just down the road from where I lived in Hawthorne, about 5 minutes walk away. I later met the daughters, helped them exhume their father's body from the former Pentridge grounds, and then conducted his private funeral. It was the last church funeral service that I conducted back in 2008. I'm sure that it was Ryan's execution and all that preceded it that led John Barry and others like Phil Opus, Alan Bartholomew and David Biles to support the foundation of the Australian and New Zealand Society of Criminology. In 1972, I commenced studies at the University of Melbourne as a young Jesuit student. 4 years into my 14-year training, I enrolled in Criminology A. There I was taught by Dennis Challenger and Deirdre Grieg and the late Alan Bartholomew and the late David Biles, amongst others. From those earliest years, I subscribed to the Journal and attended the John Barry Memorial Lecture each year and was privileged to deliver that lecture in 2010. My teachers and those that I met at the annual conferences during those years inspired me not to follow the norm and teach at one of the Jesuits' prestigious high schools during my 2-year internship following university studies. Instead, in 1977, I founded a halfway house for highly institutionalised young offenders, which was later renamed the Brosnan Centre and grew into Jesuit Social Services. And this year marks their 40th anniversary. Once ordained in 1981, I began part-time and later full-time chaplaincy at Pentridge Prison until 1992. This intense exposure to the harshness of the prison environment led me to focus on criminal justice reform. Several staff of the Criminology department and several members of the society later became members of the Victorian Criminal Justice Coalition, which operated through the 1990s. I include there Ari Freiberg, Deidre Grieg, the late Adam Sutton, Ken Polk and the late Christine Alder. We failed on private prisons, but we succeeded at least in reforming Victoria Police use of deadly force and later high-speed police pursuits. But through the 1970s and the 1980s, the most prominent penal reformers were Dame Phyllis Frost and I suggest Father John Brosnan, Pentridge chaplain from 1956 to 85. Now, I'm sure Dame Phyllis was a member of the society. She was an active member of many, many social reform organisations. She'd just front the Premier's office without an appointment and make her complaint, and politicians and senior public servants were mostly wise enough not to disobey. John Brosnan's approach was very different. He didn't confront, but engaged using an enormously effective social network and huge media profile. He strongly supported the work of the Society, especially through his associate Alan Bartholomew. Visiting Parliament House in Melbourne with him in those days, the ministers would all line up to greet him in the reception foyer. But he also lobbied quietly at other places, Flemington, Caulfield, and at the Dogs on Monday night at Olympic Park. Now, I'm not sure how many Liberal ministers attended the Dogs at Olympic Park. 20 years after his retirement from Pentridge, 3,000 people attended his state funeral at St Pat's Cathedral in 2003. But in those days, clergy and church justice departments and prison chaplains were more prominent than they are today. The Melbourne Catholic Church, for example, committed 2 full-time priests as prison chaplains until 20 years ago. While the Victorian prison population has trebled since that time, the Catholic Church's main presence is an 80-year-old religious sister and volunteer priests to say Mass on weekends. Meanwhile, they're spending millions of dollars on the No campaign in the marriage debate. In more recent years, I supported the work of the late Professor Tony Vincent by project managing the first 3 of his national postcode studies. Tony's commitment to prison reform increased from the time that he was appointed to head the New South Wales Prison Service after the Nagle Royal Commission in 1978. In his later years, his research showed the high correlations between 25 or more disadvantaged variables and promoted crime prevention through community development and social cohesion rather than criminal justice interventions. Now, while the Australian-New Zealand Society has been very influential in the past, it's noteworthy that much of its membership is strongest in people of my generation. This was the case with the Victorian Council for Civil Liberties until recent times. Now Liberty Victoria has a very active membership among young professionals and recently drew around 800 people to hear Gillian Trigg speak at their annual dinner. There are many, many fine young criminologists involved in presenting at our annual conference each year. It's illuminating, though, to examine the specialist focus of the many extensive topics being covered. Now, only a month or two ago, the ABS produced the figures, Australia Corrections, June 2017, which pointed out that the growth rate of the prison population in Australia has been four times the rate of the national population over a period of 20 years. What's happened throughout Australia over the last 2 decades, I suggest, is shocking in relation to the introduction of mandatory sentencing, post-sentence detention, and the general overuse of imprisonment. I don't believe that there's enough young criminologists taking a broader critical view of this situation. My observation is that the society could facilitate a greater engagement with the critical criminology network and mentor young reformers to continue our proud history of reform into the future. With recent technological advances, it's now not out of the question to consider the goal of prison abolition. Physical incarceration should no longer be seen as a necessary sanction for around 90% of our current prison population. We need to identify the likes of the younger professionals who were present to found the society back in 1967. One example would be providing greater access, for instance, to the annual conference each year. It costs me $2,000 to go there. Many of the young academics that I'm in contact with are given the opportunity of attending one conference a year. Many of them choose our society's conference, others don't. So the challenge is to mentor more of this new group of young professionals into leadership roles like Tara, and a commitment to the promotion of human rights and social justice in the Australian criminal justice system today. I think I've got a minute or two. Corporal punishment was mentioned before, and Bill O'Malley was mentioned. I had the privilege of having a beer with Bill in Young and Jackson's on the very day that he was released. I was waiting around Flinders Street Station for a young fellow getting out of Ararat prison in 1979, and to fill in time I went over to the downstairs bar, and here was a short, chubby, young, older fellow surrounded by people about 50 or 100, Friday afternoon I believe it was, looking at Bill O'Malley. And I spotted him and wandered over and said, Bill, I'll shout you a beer. And he said, no, it was, I wasn't ordained. Peter, I'll shout you one. So he shouted me a beer on the first day out of prison. But we have a lot of history in the society. I think it's a history to be proud of, particularly from the early instigators back in 1967. I just believe that given what's happening in the broader field in Australia over the last 20 years in particular, we have to recommit ourselves to a stronger reform agenda, and we have to mirror, if you like, what Council for Civil Liberties, Liberty Victoria has done over the last 3 years, including hundreds and hundreds of new members who become very active in their cause. Thank you.
Now I'd like to ask Emeritus Professor Ari Freiberg, AM, who was President from 1995 to 1998 and former Foundation Chair in Criminology at the department here, to come and speak to us.
Thanks very much, Russell, and thanks for the invitation. It's been a very long time since someone gave me an essay topic to do, Russell. I always cavil at being told what to do, but in deference to you and the society, Russell said, would you mind writing about your recollections of ANZSOC in the 1970s and the relationship between the society and tertiary teaching and research? I mean, I don't have a recollection of what happened yesterday, let alone the 1970s. So that was a real challenge, and I had to look around to see what I could recall and spark my interest. But the photo out there did spark a recollection, and you'll notice if you look at the photo there that I'm wearing exactly the same tie as I wore then, whenever that photo was taken. There are some other recollections listening to the speakers that I'll come back to. It's also tragic to observe how many times we've referred to the wheel turns and is forever still. We end up in the same place arguing about juvenile justice, mandatory sentencing, and we're talking about whipping and it being in the past. Tomorrow I'm flying off to Singapore to speak to their biannual every 2 years, conference of judges, and their range of intermediate sanctions, shall I say, is limited. They still have capital punishment. They still have caning. And some years ago I was taken on a tour of Changi Prison and shown the whipping room and the frame upon which it occurs. I still feel ill at the thought of it. But those battles are not won, and they're fought in very many places in the world, and we do continue to struggle. We'll never be out of a job in criminology, we can be assured of that. It's also worrying that I tend to go to more and more functions where the words 50 or 40 appear and I can remember them. But I wasn't there at the inauguration. Fortunately, I'm going to say too young, but look, there's a young, agile, able Duncan and many other people here. But it is both fitting and symbolic that this lunch is being held at the same university and nominally the same room as the inaugural meeting 50 years ago, because it re-emphasises the bond between the society and the tertiary education sector. And although the majority of attendees at that auspicious meeting were not academics, the presence of the David Biles, Duncan, Deirdre, Stan Johnson, Ken Shatwell, the support of Peter Bretts, whose memory I don't hold in reverence because he marked my honours thesis. It was on, see, these memories come back. When I wrote this, I just mentioned Peter Brett, but I remember he marked my honours thesis. Let's just say I had rather poor sense of humour in those days. It's all past now, of course. But I did it on eyewitness identification. And I thought, this is going to be a fairly boring paper on, you know, the psychology and the like, because I was doing criminology and law. So I found a cartoon, and it was a line-up of men, and let's just say the lower parts were visible in a cartoonish kind of way, and the identificants were saying, that's him, that's the flasher. I thought that was hilarious, but Peter Brett seemed to lack a sense of humour and didn't give me the mark I deserved, I thought. Anyway, Peter was there in support. My mentor and great intellectual idol, Mary Daunton-Fear, sent her support. Geoffrey Saw, John Seymour, were all evidence of the initial and continuing role of the Academy in the development of criminology. I'm pleased to say over the ensuing 5 decades I had the honour and pleasure to work with or near most of these criminological pioneers. Amongst its other purposes, the Society was established to foster training and research in criminology in institutions of learning, to bring together persons actively engaged in teaching and practices in criminology, and to promote study, understanding and cooperation in criminology, among other purposes. And the Society has done so in many ways, for example, as we've heard, through its conferences, prizes and publications. People have been retelling their own personal journeys, and mine started here in 1968 when I enrolled in law and criminology was then, even though it's a diploma, you could do it as a combined degree, and that was a blessed and wonderful day. The idea of combined degrees, to which I'm a great devotee, was important. In those days, I think we had 7 or 8 units in criminology, psychology, statistics and the like. It was terrific. You're supposed to do 4/5 of your studies in law and about 1/5 of your studies over the 5 years in criminology. I reversed that. I thought law was the most crushingly boring degree one could imagine, and I fled from it as soon as I could. But that was a wonderful investment on my part to spend time down in Barry Street, not leaping up the stairs in leaps and bounds, more like crawling, because I have short legs, unlike David. And that was a terrific refuge. I also recall when Ian spoke and mentioned his own journey, a long repressed animus towards him, which I've harboured for 50 years or so. I'm sorry to say this, Ian, but you were a lecturer, you'd been to Chicago, you'd done wonderful things, but you were enrolled in criminology, and I think the year that I graduated, you got the first prize, and I've hated you ever since. But well done, I think you've gone on reasonably well. Yeah. I first became a member of the Society in 1974. I don't hold grudges, by the way, it's fine. That was my first year as a professional criminologist, and I had just taken up my very first job at the newly established Australian Institute of Criminology, where David Biles some time previously had invited me to take up a job there. I'd been travelling overseas after my long studies, and my mother, traditional good Jewish mother, when I came back and said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I don't know, I'll find something to do." She said, "Well, I want you to do articles. I want you to become a lawyer." I said, "Well, I want you to, I want you to have a real job. You never know." I said, "I want to be a criminologist." "What is a criminologist?" "Don't worry, So I started articles in a small firm. It was crushingly boring, and again, being patronised by the office clerk, being shown how to go down to the titles office and photocopy. I thought, this is not the life for me. And I got the letter about halfway through from David inviting me, and I think it was Justice Muirhead was then the chair, and I begged the Council of Legal Education, or whoever was the admitting authority. I said, "Look, I promise you, just give me the articles. I promise, I swear that I will never, ever practice law. You have my word." They didn't believe me, and I had to finish it off. But and my mother's still waiting for me to get a proper job. So I went up to Canberra, the newly established institute, and Mary Dorton-Fear had come over from Adelaide, and they were indeed the young and heady days of criminology. Lionel Murphy was Attorney General. When he was not smashing down the doors of ASIO, he was encouraging criminology and the study, and they were great days. Sadly, David's no longer with us, as we've heard, and I think the Institute is not quite the same body, he said diplomatically, as it was in the 1970s. That's all I'll say on the record. This year, the Society is auspicing the 30th Annual Criminology Conference, albeit it's called annual, but it's not been held every year, I think, when you follow the records. The very first conference was an initiative of Ken Polk and Christine Alder of the Melbourne Criminology Department, and more strength to them. And it was held in Sydney in 1985. And the conferences were and still are an important site for the development of ideas, either embryonic or nearly fully formed, as well as providing the occasion to create or maintain research networks. Mark Finane, whose name is coming up quite frequently, is a great recorder of history, in his 2007 presidential address observed that prior to the establishment of the conferences, the lack of a significant and regular forum for the presentation of legal research may have inhibited the development of criminological research in this country. I have a footnote if you just worry about that. Now, while many conference papers have informed and influenced those relatively few that attended the sessions in which they were given, it's more likely that their effect was far greater when they eventually found their way into publication. The journal was established in 1968, and from the inception of the conferences, a number of papers subsequently appeared in that journal. Of course, the journal was not the only publication destination for conference papers. Not Truth, not the same Southdown Press, but other prestigious publications. And it was through their appearance in print and their subsequent use in teaching materials and resources for research that the link between the society, teaching and research is created. Now, it would be a large, almost impossible task to trace the relationship between the presentation of conference papers and subsequent publication, but it's now well beyond my mere and meagre emeritorial resources. But on a personal level, you like that one? On a personal level, I can attest that the conference was, for many years, the springboard for many publications. My first paper was at the second conference, 1986, and when I look through my electronic records, which I gratefully have, I had papers at the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th and 29th conference in 2016, and all subsequently appeared in print in a variety of journals. And for me, possibly others, volunteering to present a paper provided that impetus to write and meet a deadline. Too often you find that good intentions dissipate over time unless there's an external imperative, namely in November I've got to stand and give a paper. And I always found that a salutary exercise. Focus the mind, get rid of it. But as well as sharing ideas, the conferences also ran sessions on teaching criminology. And although I can't demonstrate a link between the Society, its conferences and the growth of criminology courses around the country, I would suggest that there is a symbiosis between the three. And I think the Society has both encouraged and legitimised the field of criminology over its 50 years. A welcome development and perhaps more direct link between the Society and criminological research was the institution of the annual Postgraduate and Early Career Conference in 2007, the aim of which is to provide postgrads and early career researchers with an opportunity to test their ideas with their peers, interested academics and professionals. And like the conferences themselves, the participants were researching an extraordinary range of topics, which I think reflect the current vibrant state of criminology in Australia. Similarly, the establishment of the new Scholar Prize, the Student Paper Prize, the Best Abstract Prize, all serve to encourage students at all levels of tertiary study, and again cements the link between the Society and the Academy. We can remember in a sense, the birth of the discipline in Australia, and 50 years is a relatively short time in the history of any discipline. And Australian criminology, as we've seen, has grown and thrived over that time, due in no small part to the Society. And I'd hope and expect that that relationship between the Society and the Academy will continue to expand, and that the younger scholars of today will celebrate the Society's centenary with the same degree of pride and enthusiasm as we've shown today. So well done, Society, well done to you all. Thanks.
Would you please welcome Professor Ken Polk, who was president in 1991 and professor in the department here.
The main purpose of this discussion is to talk about Christine, and I'll get to that in a minute. But let me ask a question. As you can tell almost immediately when I speak, I don't come from these parts. Where I come from is a different place. And criminology is located differently. It's located almost always in sociology departments, although there are now some criminal justice departments. But interestingly enough, the training that you receive and the frame of reference and whatever is very different. Why is that? And what are the implications of it? It's worth thinking about because, for example, one of the consequences is that law is much more prominent in Australia than in the United States in criminology. Is that good or is that bad? It is. I blame, as a matter of fact, King Henry. Now, the story about King Henry VIII is complicated, and there are a variety of different interpretations. Let's assume that what he really wanted was an heir. That is, he really needed male progeny. Therefore, he needed a woman who would produce such. Anyway, the story gets complicated. And at a certain point, he had decided that Anne Boleyn was a suitable candidate for this exercise that he had in mind. And he decided to obtain a divorce. Now, in order to obtain that divorce, it got complicated because the Pope got involved in a complicated story. In essence, what happened was he decided that he was the King of England, and England had to be separated, and the institutions, the ecclesiastical institutions, were all going to be separated, and that the religion now would be his religion. Included in that was Cambridge and Oxford. And from that point on, the development of those institutions was different. And the development of institutions in the United States was different. So it's intriguing, complicated. I asked the question, how come it's different? How come criminology is what it is? Something to think about. I pass it on to you. The main part of my discussion is, in fact, I had thought that this was going to be very different. I thought that we were going to talk in order, and that as president, I would say I wasn't president for very long, a matter of months. It was transitory, and Christine took over, and we have that history. What Christine did was to form, and the important thing that which Ari mentioned, was that she organized the conferences. In the first 3 or 4 conferences were certainly a function of Christine Alder and her view of criminology, her view of how it ought to be organized. For example, one of the features of the conferences in that time was that the conference fee was less than $100. The conference fee this year is $840. I don't know about you folks, but I have no institution that I can call upon, so I don't go to those conferences anymore. I throw it out as an issue. Christine Alder, I think, had a vision, and the purpose of this presentation is really to discuss that vision. I think that she was concerned that criminology recognized the role of women, and certainly her work, as you look at the many years that she was at the University of Melbourne, she worked very effectively and very hard on the issue of the role of women in the department, the role of women in criminology, the problem of women inside of criminology. There are lots of different aspects that she was focusing on. I think that we owe her a debt, and I certainly acknowledge that debt to you today. So anyway, my intention originally was to get up and say, thank you, Christine. Thank you for your attention, and very well. Thank you.
Another perspective from North America and Australia, Professor Peter Grabowski, who was president, so I just refresh my memory, 98 to 2003, I think, when he was at the Institute, and was one of the lucky people who took on the position after having been tapped on the shoulder and willingly agreed to take it on.
Thank you very much, Russell. Good afternoon, everyone. I spent the year 1967 involved in the heroic struggle for national liberation of the Vietnamese people. To my ultimate great satisfaction, I was on the losing side. That's a picture that out there is from 1967. Anyhow, fast forward to 1972 and my first interface with this society. I was a fringe dweller at the Sydney University Institute of Criminology in their law school in October 1972, having been guided there by none other than Duncan Chappell, who provided me with some good advice as to where to hang out and who to make contact with. And so I did, and I encountered very familiar names: Gordon Hawkins, Paul Ward, Greg Woods, and one day I was kind of hanging out there when it turns out it was an event was coming on, and they asked me if I would mind just dropping in on it. And I said, "What is it? What is it?" And they said, "Well, it's the executive meeting of the Australian and New Zealand Society of Criminology." And I said, "Well, I'm an outsider. And come on in, come on anyway." And I said, "Great, okay." And there was a lot of business. I'm not sure who the secretary was. Were you there then yet, Dennis?
No idea.
72? Either Dennis or David Biles, I reckon. Anyhow, David Biles, whom I had only heard the couple of days before on the radio saying most sensible and insightful things about the overuse of imprisonment in Australia and so on. And there he was, large as life. And the meeting went on, and a lot of it really had no meaning for me because it was kind of esoteric, and I was immersed in the study of colonial records at the time. But I did remember, for some strange reason, the words Southdown Press. And then 45 years later. And I had no idea of its great cultural significance, as we've subsequently learned. Anyhow, the words Southdown Press were to come back to me in future years. I went back to Chicago, where I was hanging out, and then eventually made my way back to Adelaide in 1978. And at that time, there were no ANZSOC conferences. I should mention, back to 1972. One of the most prominent participants in this executive meeting was, of course, none other than Alan Bartholomew, who at the time was soliciting manuscripts for the journal. And he said, and I quote, "I need stuff," unquote. And he's a pretty formidable person. Those of you who knew him, wasn't the kind of guy you'd say no to, is it? So I said, "Well, I'm working on things, and maybe in the fullness of time I'll have something for you. But thank you very much for your invitation," and so on. And I'm not sure whether it was at that time or a couple of years later when I actually became a member of the society. The society archaeologists will be able to determine this more definitively. But I don't think there's any relationship between my having become a member and Alan Bartholomew's acceptance of the manuscript that I ultimately submitted. I suspect that the amount of editorial scrutiny that he accorded it varied inversely with the number of reviewers that he conscripted to look at the manuscript, because he gave me a very quick turnaround and a very favorable decision. But anyhow, it was that time that I became a member. Subsequently, I went away for a while and came back to Adelaide in the late 1970s. And again, the archaeologists can hold me to task on this, but I do remember in those days there was an organization, it may still exist, but it was the Australian and New Zealand Association for the Advancement of Science, ANZSOC. There were no criminology conferences in those days, except those that were put on an ad hoc basis by the Institute of Criminology in Canberra, or the Sydney University Institute of Criminology. And ANZSOC was coming to Adelaide, and the number of criminologists in Adelaide in the late 1970s, you could count on the fingers of one hand. Or three of the fingers on one hand. But we had practitioners who were interested in criminology, and one of them, Peter Norman, who was the master of the Supreme Court for years and years and years, said, "Let's have a section on criminology at ANZSOC." And I said, "Okay." So he said, "Well, would you put it together?" And I said, "Sure." So I put together this 1980 panel, and it included people like Ray Whitrod, who was living there at the time and became a champion of victims' rights, and we got some free participation from IBM, who were very interested in selling computers to the South Australian government in those days, and And so that was my only involvement in organizing an ANZSOC conference, and it wasn't really an ANZSOC conference, but it was kind of a prototype, so to speak. And I must say that attending many of the ones that have been conducted, beginning with the ones that Ken and Christine produced, and it's just amazing, the kinds of events that occur today when you think of them in comparison to the prototypes of yesteryear. Anyhow, it was 1998. I was sitting at lunch. The conference, I think, might have been in Brisbane at that time. And Ari Freiberg came up to me and said, I'm near the end of my second term, and it's time for you to become president. I said, I didn't. I said, well, yeah, I think I need more time. Not old enough yet. He said, it's your time. And he said, leave it with me. I'll fix it. Right? I thought he came from Sydney, right? I mean, he sounded like he was from Sydney. Leave it with me, mate. I'll fix it for you. So I said, thanks. Okay. So then a few months later, here's Ari on the phone. He said, congratulations, mate. You're on. Thank you. And so the question was, what do I do next? And I said, well, I really don't want the job unless John Myrtle can be the secretary, because I knew that with John Myrtle around, everything would be fine. And so anything good that happened in those years was really down to John Myrtle, and anything that went wrong probably went wrong because I didn't heed the wide counsel of John Myrtle. Anyhow, John was, as he has been in many capacities over the years, one of the real drivers of the society. There are three things that I guess were noteworthy in that period. First was the prizes that we created: the Young Scholar Award, the Student Paper Award, and the Best Article in the Journal Award. I was keen then to encourage younger people to become involved in the society. And I thought a Young Scholar Prize and a Student Paper Prize might help excite their interest in becoming involved. The second thing I did, which may well be without precedent and may not have been matched since, was to preside over a reduction in the annual society dues. Again, in terms of quantity and accuracy of this boast, I'll again defer to the archaeologists to keep me honest, but I think we did actually reduce the dues a little bit. Mind you, they weren't that high in the first place, but again, we'll let Russell comment more authoritatively on that. But we did reduce the dues. And third, and not least, was Southdown Press, the last hurrah of Southdown Press, whom we had realized were profiting more from the engagement than was the society. I think Southdown was publishing the journal at no cost to us, but for no revenue to us either. And so we thought, well, gee, maybe we can get a better deal with another publisher. And once again, John Myrtle stepped up to the plate and said, there's this little outfit in Brisbane, Australian Academic Press, and they might be able to do a better deal for us. And indeed, we contacted them, and indeed, they did. So that was the first move, and we began to get a little revenue, which was nice. Not enough to throw big parties, but it helped. And of course, that set the precedent for the subsequent move from AAP to Sage Publications, which I understand has been very beneficial to the society. And so at that point, I decided to live up to my old adage to leave business to younger generations and fade quietly away. And so I have. And It's great to be here and to revisit old times, and particularly to look to the future and what our leaders of today are doing and where they're taking the society. And it's very, very gratifying to have been a part of its archaeology. Thank you very much.
I'd like to welcome our next speaker, who's also got a North American background but is ensconced firmly in Queensland, Professor Kathleen Daly, who's also a Fellow of the Society and was President from 2005 to 2009.
I thought I'd give a little background because there is a bit of history to my coming to Australia and to the Society before I make some remarks. I first came to Australia in 1994, the first ANZSOC conference, where I was a plenary speaker invited from the United States. The conference was in Sydney. It was convened by the University of New South Wales. It was a great conference. I really enjoyed it. I relocated to Australia in 1995 at the kind of urging and assistance of several of you in this room. I attended an ANZSOC meeting in 1996 in Wellington, and I've been attending meetings ever since. With some exceptions, the last few years I haven't come as regularly. I convened the ANZSOC conference in 1997 and also in 2002 at Griffith University. With Peter's welcoming approach, I was roped into becoming a member of the Committee of Management in 2001. I became Vice President the next year in 2002 until 2005, and then President 2005 to 2009. So it's a bit of background. I want to make a few points in my remarks. First, I want to sing the praises of volunteerism. Without the hundreds of people over the past 50 years, and we've heard from a lot of them, who gave their time, thought, and leadership, the Society obviously could not exist. It could not have functioned. Over the years, the major heavy lifting roles are president, and depending on what's going on, vice president, certainly journal editor, and conference convener. And until 2008, the secretary and treasurer. Of course, we also have the editor of the newsletter. Now, the first newsletter was started in 2000 when Peter was president, and he credits Tony Mackay with the idea. It went for 2 years. It then went into 4 years of not publishing and revived when I became president, really at the urging of Bronwyn Naylor, who took on that role. Over the last 10 years, we've created more volunteer roles by establishing the postgraduate conference and increasing the number of awards beyond the ones initially established by Peter. So we have a lot more awards and prizes today. With the 50th anniversary committee, more roles were created, some of them short-term. A major one with the anniversary committee's activities was the handbook edited by Rick and Anchi. We have also a long-term project, I think, underway, a planned oral history project, which I think will be fantastic. And, of course, a significant role created with the idea of this anniversary lunch, for which I really thank Russell again. You've done a magnificent job. So all of us in the room have invested time and energy in launching and developing the Society and seeing it grow. And there's a huge number outside this room, as well as those no longer with us, who have made a difference. So I sing the praises of volunteerism. But the second point I want to make is that there are limits to volunteerism in running a society like ours. When I was on the Committee of Management, for example, before I became president, we did not know the number of members. We didn't know how many we had, nor who was financial exactly. It was always a kind of a rubbery amount. The annual membership renewal process was labor intensive, and here I emailed Matthew Willis, who was the treasurer during my time as president, and he was a fantastic worker for the organization. And he talked about what would happen during the renewal period. He says, "Hi, Kathy. I remember those days well. Many hours were spent recording check numbers, writing out paper receipts, hand addressing letter after letter, sticking on the stamps. I had quite the system with little piles of receipts, the strategically placed official self-inking ANZSOC stamp, the ever more teetering stack of letters, And if you can believe it, at the time, this was 2006, 2007, it was just at that point that we introduced electronic banking. And he said helping to introduce the newfangled electronic banking system was certainly an achievement, and definitely it was. We were in the bad old days of paper, receipting, etc., and that changed tremendously. So I became acutely aware when I first came in as president of the impact of these practices on our finances. We had a short period of time between the renewal deadline and when we sent the list of names to our publisher, AAP, for those who had renewed. We lost money every year because we often would subsidize a journal subscription when they hadn't paid their renewal fee. We were also annually losing money. The reduction in membership fee to $90 did not cover the cost of printing and mailing the journal annually, which is $108. And the receipts that we got from the journal there were some receipts, but the costs of mailing it out were much more. So we made no profit from the journal at all. It took some time to get all the elements in place, but in August 2008, we had a part-time paid secretary. That was the first month that occurred in August 2008. And her main role was to straighten out the membership and payment process, which took a little while, increase the Society's presence at the conference, and I think one of the most important things that happened, the coordination of the creation of the ANZSOC website. Now, Russell was deeply involved in that, as was I, as was Matthew and Damon Miller. So there was a group effort, but our secretary really moved that into being. The launch of the website in July 2009 was, in my view, a transformative moment in the Society's history. I recall that some years earlier, in February 2005, at a special ANZSOC meeting in the Wellington Conference, many members said that we needed to create a website. Sure, I thought, great idea, but it required more than volunteers to make it happen. Another transformation of the Society during my time was shifting publishers from AAP to SAGE. This shift boosted the revenue that the Society received from the journal. That is, we made net profits over time. Also, another significant aspect of the SAGE contract that we had digitization of the back issues. There was constant reference to back issues in Peter Grabowski's attic, which I think somebody finally squired away. And also, of course, the Scholar One platform. And you may remember in the bad old days receiving a manuscript to review from John Pratt. You'd have your name scrolled over the envelope. But we now had a new platform, a standard professional way to submit and review journals. Just to give you an idea of our financial situation, in 2003, our net assets were $39,000. They increased to $69,000 in 2004 with the injection of profits from the Sydney conference from Don Weatherburn's role as convener. As of fiscal year 2016, and I hope that Lee will update us to fiscal year 2017, our net assets were $214,500. So we have really increased our amount of money in the bank over time. And that came, I think, ultimately from hiring a secretary and a few other things along the way. To sum up, then, we rely on a large number of volunteers to do the work of the Society, but we have to be mindful of the limits of volunteerism. And that leads me to my third point. As we look ahead to new projects and activities, we must ensure that they are supported. Otherwise, our volunteers will burn out. I was burned out from the role after 4 years. I really couldn't do anything for a little while, I'll be frank. It's taken me some time to come back, and I'm sure I'm not the only ANZSOC volunteer who's had this experience. We also need to be more efficient with our time. I have in mind the conference convener role. Yes, we have the conference planning handbook, which Don Weatherburn created and which subsequently goes through the hands of subsequent conveners and updated. But each year, the wheel is reinvented by a new group of people who spend significant time planning the conference. What I would like to see, perhaps 5 years from now, perhaps it will take longer, is a paid position of executive director, modeled along the lines of other organizations. Now, obviously, this will cost some money. We need to get a business plan sorted. but let me give you the concept. The executive director would oversee the major activities of the society: membership, conference, journal publisher, and governance. And there'd be a variety of other related tasks. With continuity in the role and expertise in negotiating hotels, keeping costs down, for example, and publishing arrangements, an executive director can undertake all the major, what we might consider the platform tasks to keep the society going and thriving, and take this burden off the shoulders of our volunteers. Now, a lot of our comments in the last 6 hours, 4 hours, have been focused on the ideas that come from criminology, but we need a platform to make sure that those can continue. And I'm talking about the platform, I think, the infrastructure that makes it possible for us to make a difference. I want to conclude on that note with an observation and several questions. Several days ago, I attended an annual dinner for the World Day Against the Death Penalty. The speaker was the president of the Law Council of Australia, Fiona McLeod. The subject of her talk was the circumstances that led to Ronald Ryan's death on the 3rd of February 1967, about which we've heard a lot today. And I was glad to hear how it related to the Society's formation, because it filled in some blanks for me. Fiona said, "We know what prevents other countries from abolishing the death penalty is political will. So how do we, as a legal profession and as concerned individuals and organizations, nurture this will throughout the world?" Well, one initiative that the Law Council is promoting, and the variety of things they are promoting, is the creation of, quotes, "a council of eminent persons, including senior judges, lawyers, and those with specialist knowledge in the field, who could act as influencers and advance regional discussions." I observed that criminology was not mentioned. I wonder, when will it be on the Law Council's list? This leads me to think of another point I want to make, a related point that some of you have also raised. Over the years at AGMs, a question is often raised: how can the Society take a role in promoting effective policies in respect of crime and justice, as some have said we seem to be going backwards, or in speaking against those that are misguided? Many individuals within the Society do this, and it's great, but it's another matter to have a society position, what we do as a group, a collectivity. Now, I don't have an answer or a plan, but I do put it forward as a question for the future, and I would like to reinforce the comments of Peter Norden in this respect, that we need to think about how the Society can have another kind of platform, not just within the conference, important as that is, to think about how we can beam out some of the ideas that we would like to see for change. And I say that we, because being a broad church, there's bound to be a diversity of view, which make a society position a bit tricky. So I leave that as a question for all of you to consider. Thank you.
So we've got our current New Zealand Vice President, Dr. Angie Deckert, who's going to tell us a bit about developments in New Zealand from 1967 and onwards.
John Robson is the person I want to talk about. You have mentioned him, Tara, and Dr. Muthil informed us today about how John Robson became the first voluntary member of ANZSOC, as he was sort of volunteered by his friend, his close friend, Barry. And during lunch we talked about how Barry died in 1969, and during that same year John Robson lost another close friend of his, and that was Robert Hennon. After serving a decade as Assistant Secretary for Justice under Sam Barnett, Robson served as Secretary for Justice from 1960 to 1971. And as such, he worked alongside Robert Hennon, who was Minister of Justice from 1960 until his death in 1969. And you also informed me that he actually died at the SCAG conference in Cairns. Robson and Hennon were what you could call a dynamic duo. They campaigned successfully to abolish capital punishment in New Zealand. and also the rule of silence in prisons and the bread and water diet. They expanded probation services to include rehabilitation programs, and they introduced novel penal policies such as periodic detention, the 1/3 sentence remission, and home leave. So in 1969, Hannon passed away, and also Barry, and 2 years later, John Robson ended his administrative career and became a visiting fellow at Victoria University. Now, he became a member of ANZSOC in 1967, so we're thinking 1967, 1969, and 2 years later he's becoming the visiting fellow. So he was already influenced by his Australian peers, I believe, at that time, because his fellowship culminated in him founding the Institute of Criminology as an independent teaching and research facility, which sort of symbolizes the start of academic criminology in Aotearoa. And Dr. Middle also informed me that Australian government officials contacted Robson over and over again before they decided on forming the AIC. Which was the idea, obviously, that they got from Robson through the Institute of Criminology. But the Institute of Criminology did never expand to the same level as the AIC did. It remained it remained an academic department within the university in Wellington. And Robson served as the director of the Institute from 1972 to 1980, and due to his previous position in government, he was able to obtain government funding for the Institute, and maybe at the time he thought that it could expand into something like the AIC. But as I said, it never happened. But he was undoubtedly, at the time, the most well-equipped person to bridge that gap between policy and academia. And others followed. The name Greg Newbold probably rings a bell for many, who started teaching criminology as a subject at Canterbury University. He is a self-professed what do you call it? Convict criminologist, thank you. And AUT founded its criminology program in 2007, and the University of Auckland, which had taught some criminology papers until then, had a formally established program in 2008. Waikato University, Otago and Massey also teach criminology papers. Another renowned name in penal policy in New Zealand is Kim Workman. He actually took undergraduate papers under John Robson at Victoria in the early 70s. And in a conversation with me, he described him as an activist administrator rather than a politician. And that speaks a lot to what Peter said, and also what Kathy was sort of demanding that happens more again. And that is activism to actually influence policy. However, even though he was probably the best equipped person to bridge the gap between policy and academia, his retirement in 1980 came as a bit of a relief for both sides, for the government department as well as for Robson, because he found it difficult to reconcile his passion for teaching and historical research with the immediate research needs of his former department. Arguably, this gap between the New Zealand policy sector and academia persists to this day. Government departments such as the Department of Corrections, Ministry of Justice and Ministry for Māori Development maintain their own research units, which often work isolated and not alongside academic experts. Research funding is rarely ring-fenced for criminological topics. We tend to compete with other social scientists for the small pockets of social sciences research monies. While Australia has established dedicated agency to link criminological research with relevant policy, such links remain wanting in New Zealand. And yes, I'm quoting from our book here, Rick. On the one hand, the lacking link between policy and academia means that research findings generated by academic criminologists rarely influence governmental policies, but on the other hand, it may be argued that this lacking link between policy and academia has produced a number of activist academics, sort of following the role model of Robson as an activist administrator. And I'm thinking here of people like Drs. Tracy McIntosh, Kim Workman, Elizabeth Stanley, Kylie Quinns, or Juan Tauri, who tend to produce research that is highly critical of government policies. And these activist academics are particularly critical of government policies that aim to expand the prison industrial complex and that turn a blind eye to the historical injustices such as child abuse in state care that Kathy has also written about, and socioeconomic inequalities that sustain the mass incarceration of Māori. But I was supposed to speak about ANZSOC, and I'm returning back to that. Over time, many New Zealand criminologists have been members of ANZSOC, and the dialogue with our Australian counterparts has definitely had an influence on many New Zealand academics. As I explained, Aotearoa's academic criminology has expanded vastly over the last 2 decades, and we have produced, therefore, more and published more research than ever before. This research is often focused on New Zealand topics, and I personally find that it is marked by a distinct transformative narrative, like the ones that are published now on the website of the Criminology Collective, established by Lizzie Stanley from Victoria. Oh, when I say Victoria, I mean Victoria University in Wellington. And as the incoming New Zealand Vice President, I also saw that need for more dialogue between government departments in New Zealand, and therefore asked the management committee very kindly for some funds so we could have an annual one-day criminology symposium. And for several reasons. One is to bridge that gap between the community groups and government departments that often don't have money to fly over to Australia to attend the ANZSOC conference, but we do have a need to actually converse with them. Then also allowing more emerging criminologists that Peter and Ken have alluded to. The cost of the annual meeting makes it impossible for them to attend, so we also want to encourage them to participate in the dialogue. It is in New Zealand also understood that Indigenous panels should consist of Indigenous speakers, which is not often the case at ANZSOC conferences, and acknowledging the emphasis of restorative justice in New Zealand's criminal justice system. So that is one of the sort of government-driven needs to speak more about the role of restorative justice. The symposia over the past 4 years have been a great success, not only because they were very low in cost, but also because it enabled the conversation across these different groups, including community groups, and one of which you might have heard about, Just Speak, formerly Rethinking Crime and Punishment. Now, with that thought in mind, and being aware that we are in a Japanese-themed room, I would like to draw an analogy here on kombucha. Kombucha is a Japanese drink. It's fermented tea, and I don't know if you've ever had that. It's very healthy. I produce it myself at home, and what you have is a SCOBY. It's a disc-shaped SCOBY, and you put it into a litre of tea, you add some sugar, and then you let it sit for a little while so it can ferment the tea. But what also happens is the SCOBY, the so-called mother SCOBY, is developing a baby SCOBY over time, and those two start separating. So thinking about that, as you were all talking before me, I was wondering if that is going to happen sometime soon in the future with New Zealand criminology, because of the reasons I've mentioned earlier on. it would not surprise me if the distinct narrative and the distinctive needs that criminology has in New Zealand might actually lead to a distinct New Zealand Society of Criminology in the near future. Not in order to upset our Australian counterparts, but maybe because we have grown up so much with the help of ANZSOC. And I believe the next panel is going to speak on the futures of criminology in Australia and New Zealand, and I think it might be a nice segue to end it here. Thank you very much.
Now I'd like to move us into the future in the 21st century. And interestingly, you will have seen there's a slight gender imbalance in the photograph out there. All of the women are grouped at the bottom of the picture, and they're all in colour. And it's not intentional, it's basically chronological. Anyhow, one of the very old ones in the new regime is Professor Rick Sarr, who was president from 2012 to 16. And I'd like to welcome Rick to give us a few observations about the future and recent past.
Thank you, Russell. Now, I'm just checking on the camera here that I'm not left-leaning like Challenger over here, or right-leaning like anyone else over here. I'm right in the middle here. That's kind of where I take my cue from. I'm very grateful to be here for two reasons. One is I love celebrations. I love getting together. We do it at the university all the time, and I just think this is fantastic. And when we started planning this a couple of years ago, this lunch was always going to be a highlight. The other reason I'm grateful is that 24 hours ago I was in the Kansas City airport looking at the boards talking about delayed flights and wondering whether I was ever going to get to LA, which I did. And as I got there and walked into the LA airport, and they had the 3 Australian flights. Qantas has 3 flights out each night: Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. Brisbane 3-hour delay, Sydney 3-hour delay, Melbourne on time. I thought, the criminological gods are with me. So I got in this morning at 8 o'clock, and here I am now, and about to fall over, but otherwise okay. I do want to thank Russell, as others have done, for his work in putting this together. If you want something done well, you ask Russell. And I'm delighted that he's honorary, because if you actually had to pay for his time, the society would be broke. So I'm delighted. Although he did put me down in deference as 2:45. I think that was in deference to South Australian time, but here we are now at 3:15. And indeed, Russell did ask me in the letter, that same letter presumably that Dennis Challenger and others have received, to focus on the history of the society, but I'm going to actually combine a little bit of history of the society with the future. In relation to the history, I'm simply going to refer you to a couple of excellent chapters in the handbook that Anchi and others have mentioned. Add a shameless plug here. Here it is. I'm holding it up for the camera. For the Duncan Chappell's chapter. I think it's one of the earliest, if not the first chapter of the book, looking at the history of criminology, or at least the last half century here in South Australia, and then followed shortly thereafter by a chapter from James Rogers and Philip Stenning looking at the New Zealand criminological development over the same period. So I will refer those comments to you if you'd like to have any further detail. I should say something about this lovely cover here very, very quickly. When we first looked at it, New Zealand actually wasn't on the cover, which was a bit embarrassing for an Australian-New Zealand handbook. So what we did was we shifted it around, at which point we lost Western Australia. We then fiddled with it a bit, and we finally got everything but Shark Bay and Gisborne, and north of Cairns and just north of Theresa Cunningham in Darwin. So every Australian-New Zealand criminologist's home is on this map somewhere. Unless someone moves up here to that part of Derby or somewhere, we're in real trouble. But so far the map is now holding true. So what's missing? Horn Island. Horn Island's missing, but Stewart Island's there. If there are any criminologists in Stewart Island, they've been included. So, but I must say, in tribute to Anchi's work, she's been absolutely fabulous in this. In relation to Anchi's knowledge of English, if she only started learning it a decade ago, she would be in the 99th percentile, as far as I'm concerned, in ability to express herself. We even had a little debate about the Oxford comma, whether you put an Oxford comma after crime. We decided to abandon the Oxford comma, after a heated debate with Kathleen Daly. But that's another story. Who loves the Oxford comma, I should say. And others today have highlighted some of the attendees of that first meeting. I'm going to highlight two of them whose names, or one name hasn't been mentioned yet, Harold Weir. Harold Weir was a fabulous man, a real mentor of mine in the early days of my teaching of criminology, and his development of curriculum around the old SAIT, South Australian Institute of Criminology, and their justice delivery was fabulous. The other one had been mentioned, Ray Whitrod's work in championing police integrity and victims' rights in South Australia when he moved to South Australia, having been, what's the best way to describe it, sidelined out of Queensland. And Ray was an absolute champion, and we note their passing with great regret. Both good friends of mine had a huge influence on my criminological thinking. Very quickly about the journal, as we've said, the journal turns 50 next year, so there will be some discussion on the committee about how to celebrate that milestone. One of the things we are doing at the last conference and the next conference, and Russell and others have been organising these panels of people who've been given old papers from the early parts of the journal on topics which are still relevant today, asking them to reflect on the last 50 or 48 years or whatever to see whether or not those ideas still hold up. And the panel that we had in Hobart was fabulous, and I'm assuming the panel we'll have in Canberra in December will also be fabulous in revisiting those papers and seeing whether they still have relevance today. Yes, we have the Alan Austin Bartholomew Prize. One of the nice things about being on that prize committee is that, of course, you had to read every article, which is not something normally one does with a journal, and I had the privilege of being part of that committee for many years, and I enjoyed that very much. I look back and refresh my memory that Alan Austin Bartholomew was, in fact, a psychiatrist, indeed a prison psychiatrist, and I suppose one would have thought that if you can manage prison psychiatry, you can manage a journal of academic criminologists. But a remarkable man and a remarkable legacy of 49 years now. Yes, conferences began in 1985, and yes, as Ari said, there are a couple of times when we waited 18 months between conferences, which means this one in Canberra is in fact our 30th conference. There will be an emphasis on the 50th anniversary, as I said, that panel and some other speeches as well, reflecting on the last 50 years. One of the legacies that my committee did was indeed to raise the prize money, so it actually now makes it more affordable for people who win prizes to come along and accept those prizes. And as Anshi mentions, also by getting, since New Zealand conferences were not going to come around more than every 6 or 7 years, to have these annual one-day colloquia in New Zealand, and as Anshi said, they've been very successful. We've had 3 now, and each one of those has been fabulous. Presidents, there have been 18 presidents, and as Ken said in discussing the American sociological emphasis, of those 18 presidents in Australia, 9 have been legally trained. In fact, the first 4 were legally trained, which is a little unusual for an American society, for example. It has been an enjoyable role. I think the most enjoyable part of that role was to pick up the telephone every year and ring the people who had just been elected as the distinguished criminologist. I've made 8 of those phone calls. 2 are here today. Kathy's here today and Duncan's here today. 2 very sadly have passed on, the late David Biles and the late Christine Alder. But they have been, to a person, a fabulous criminologist. I'll name them, in addition to the 4 I've just mentioned: John Braithwaite, Richard Harding, Janet Chan, and Kate Warner. And presumably, under wraps at the moment, there'll be 1 or 2 coming up to be announced this year. Tara's nodding her head. 1 or 2?
We'll see.
We'll see. She's keeping it very close to her chest. There we go. Just very briefly, a couple of names. People have talked about their mentors today. I have 2 mentors in criminology, looking back on my history in this discipline. One of them is John Hagan, still very active and still writing prolifically in the United States. He was my master supervisor back in Toronto many years ago. One thing I remember about John Hagan was that he was a great theorist around crime prevention as well. And even though his kids were well and truly into their 20s, he still drove around in his car with a car seat in the back, figuring that thieves are less likely to steal a car that's got a car seat in the back. And when you went round to his house, as I often did, to look at the manuscripts, upturned in the front yard were 2 or 3 children's toys. And even though the kids were now at that stage in their late teens, he figured no one's going to burgle a house if they think the people at home. And of course they would be home because there's upturned toys. If they'd noticed, the upturned toys were upturned for months at a time. And even were there during the snow as well, which always... Anyway, he wasn't burgled as far as I know. So John Hagan, a great mentor of mine. The other one I should mention, and his name is mentioned already today, the late, great Adam Sutton. I got my start in criminology in this country with Adam as a great character and a great academic. He had done all the work back in the mid-80s looking at the way in which South Australia had introduced a cannabis expiation notice. His methodology was fabulous, his collection of data was fabulous, his analysis was fabulous, and he hired me to write it up. I can string a few sentences together. I strung the sentences together. It became Sutton and Saar, Sutton and Saar, Sutton and Saar. I knew beans about methodology. I knew beans about data collection analysis, but I could write. But I'm on the radio talking about this particular study with great authority. In fact, my first ANZSOC conference when I presented a paper was 1989. I think it was here in Melbourne, and the subject was the cannabis expiation notice, our report at that stage. And the nice thing about Adam was he never, ever double-guessed that particular analysis and counted me as a full partner in that. And the fact that gave me 3 or 4 publications got me on the road down into academic life. So I do pay tribute to the late, great Adam Sutton. I also want to pay tribute to the vice presidents that I had during the course of my presidency, and I'll name them here. The 2 New Zealand ones, Julian Buchanan and, of course, Archie, and then Gail Mason, followed by Tara. And to a person, each of them was blessed with the 3 key things that you need to be a good manager in ANZSOC. 1, a keen brain, 2, common sense, and 3, a collective ability to put the collective ahead of individual self-interest. And I sing those 4 praises, the praises of those 4 people loud and clear. So to the future, Russell, as my brief was this afternoon. I think we are blessed very much with a formidable team at the moment, Tara, Archie and Rebecca, plus the vast members of the committee. And the conference that's coming up in Canberra at the beginning of December, I'm sure, will be formidable as well. So I think we're in very, very good hands. It augurs well for the future. If I can say one thing, and it's been mentioned very briefly before, about the legacy of ANZSOC in the last 50 years, the legacy that we have for policy making, I think, is significant. Now, we haven't sat down and done this in any sort of regimented way this afternoon, and in fact, it'd be a great topic for a paper, maybe at the Melbourne conference, Fiona, in 12 months' time. What legacy can we say that ANZSOC has had in relation to policy development? I think that'd be a great paper. Very quickly, as I was sitting there just then and listening to others of you, things like firearms, like domestic violence, like Indigenous imprisonment, juvenile justice, restorative justice, therapeutic jurisprudence and policing, to name a few. Some of the topics that have emerged from our discussions. Now, they're very legally based, because that's where I am, and there'd be significant features as well in the sociology, the psychological literature, the political science, and the geographic literature as well. I would have thought we've made a great contribution, generally speaking, to policy development in this country. And finally, my final thought is that we've been talking about where we'll be. I think Duncan said he's not going to be here for the 100th anniversary. I'm looking forward to the fun that Lee, Catalina, Rebecca, Tara and Archie, when they're looking back on this day in their 90s or 80s or 70s, whatever it's going to be, looking back and saying, I remember the day when we got together with all those old guys and talked about the 50th anniversary. Thanks very much.
Now I'd like to ask Rebecca Wicks, who's Associate Professor at Monash University, and our current Australian Vice President.
Looking around the room today, I'm really quite overwhelmed with my own memories of coming into the Society. back in 2003, when many of you who were around the table were presenting in one way or another, and to me you were the gods of criminology. And I remember being daunted by your intelligence and your passion for criminology, and just the sheer breadth and depth of the criminological canon in the Australian and New Zealand Society of Criminology. So it's very, it's warming for me to be here and to be part of this and to be part of your history, for I probably wouldn't have had another opportunity to have dined with Duncan Chappell or to have heard the wonderful stories of Ari Freiberg, and it's just been truly a treat. So thank you very much, I really appreciate it. Now, in contrast to some of our esteemed colleagues around the table, and in fact Professor Mark Finane, who is not here today, but who is very much a criminology historian, that I am not. So please do forgive any errors of recall in my presentation today. But I'm really going to largely focus on some of my experiences. I was on the ANZSOC Committee of Management from 2008 to 2011 when I first joined the University of Queensland, and then also I guess my experiences as a postgraduate student in criminology at Griffith University, when I think was really the time when Griffith turned from being a relatively smallish program but a very impactful program to one that is of a leading quality in the world today. And so I'll speak mainly from those perspectives, if you don't mind. So thinking back again to that introduction to ANZSOC, I had sort of been brought up at UQ, in UQ's kind of version of criminology, which, as Professor Polk mentioned, really was housed within the kind of US model of criminology, and by that I mean sociology. And so I hadn't really been in a position where I could benefit from scholars who were working in the fields of psychiatry, psychology, law, to what I could when I joined Griffith. And when I first went to the conference, in fact, Tara was my conference buddy back in 2003. My gosh. And it was in Sydney. I think it was at the Australian Technology Park, hosted by the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, in conjunction with the Institute of Criminology, Sydney University, and the School of Social Science and Policy from University of New South Wales. What immediately struck me was that compared to the sociological conferences that I had attended thus far, there was something really quite magnificent that was happening at ANZSOC. And there was such great representation from public sector organizations. I went to presentations from lawyers, from judges, magistrates, police officers, psychologists, criminologists, somebody who was in, I think he was a pharmacist, and he was talking about pseudoephedrine. So I learned more about the reach of Australian criminology in that first conference attendance in 2003 than I think would be fair to say that I had in any of my undergraduate courses to that date. So it was truly a momentous moment for me, and I do remember my first entry into ANZSOC. So as you can probably tell from my accent, I am also a migrant to Australia from the North Americas, and I arrived in Brisbane in 1995 with a young family and began my university training very soon thereafter at the University of Queensland before joining the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Griffith University at 2002. One of the things that I noticed immediately upon entering into the criminology program at Griffith was that nearly everybody was a member of ANZSOC, and in fact I had never even heard of ANZSOC when I was at UQ, which is probably just down to the point that there were about 2 people that were teaching criminology courses, and I'm pretty sure neither of them were members. They were members of TASA and very much involved with the kind of informal social control and deviance aspects of criminology. So when I got to Griffith, I was immediately instructed, this is the conference that you go to, and we go all the time, and this is now your home. And what was really evident, again, coming into Griffith University, was that Griffith was really offering, I think, and perhaps I would argue at the time, the only university in Queensland that was really offering a very broad and a very comprehensive approach to the study of criminology. And whatever knowledge that I may have that I took into the world when I graduated with my PhD in 2007, I attest to the excellent training that I had from amazing academics at Griffith University. These different intellectual experiences, and I think indeed the differential alignment with criminological society in the two institutions that I had the great fortune of being part of, I think did reflect this broader division in the study of crime in Australia, and one I think still persists, and we're getting there, and I think that's where the future of the society should be headed, is headed, and where the future of criminology is hopefully headed as well. And I think it was really that for a long time we've been split across two houses. So the first with a strong sort of vocational, professional, legal approach to the field, I think with that degree of activism that so many of you spoke about today, and it makes me long for what that's going to be, being able to see what that's going to be as we move forward. And I guess the second house really was one that was positioned around the study of crime, not as a discipline in its own right, but more as a field of inquiry underneath the sociological umbrella. This was evident in the courses that were taught at UQ at the time. And I think in terms of partnerships with government organizations, non-government organizations, what really struck me when I came to Griffith was just how vital that was actually to the day-to-day criminology of what was done. You were expected to do community outreach, you were expected to be working with governments, and even though we were meant to be critical of some of those relationships and to deeply reflect on them, we were encouraged to be part of the conversation, and so I really took with me that experience. I would argue now at this point, or at least in the last sort of 5 years, criminology programs across southeast Queensland, the big three in particular, UQ, QUT, and Griffith, are probably more alike now than they are different. And they have all evolved and changed and shaped themselves to be really, I think, quite excellent criminology programs. And I do think that across all of these universities, there's a very strong focus on partnerships with government and industry, and also, I think, equally important, understanding the pathways to crime and criminal justice across a whole range of different topic areas. I think really that this division or this split in the houses can be, really can be thought back to the Fitzgerald inquiry, and I know that everybody here is very much familiar with that, so I'm certainly not going to go into any detail, and in the interest of time, and I'm sure everyone is tired and wanting to go home soon, I'll be very brief. But I do think that when the Fitzgerald inquiry happened, Griffith was well poised to respond to a number of the recommendations that were made in that Fitzgerald inquiry, and had indeed had important links that allowed for the progression of criminology at Griffith to take a decidedly different path, I think, to QUT or indeed UQ at the time. And as Russell Smith points out, I believe in his review in the book that I'm not even in the book, so I have no vested interest in flagging it, but as Russell Smith points out, where there was public sector agencies that were really strongly concerned with research into crime and criminology in, say, New South Wales, there was BOSCAR in New South Wales and OSCAR in South Australia. There was no such entity in Queensland that I'm aware of anyway before the Fitzgerald inquiry. And so when these recommendations were made, it really required an impetus of intellectual thought and partnership. And I think that really Griffith was very well suited to step into that role and to develop very quickly. So I think that with the development of a research and coordination division that was associated with the Criminal Justice Commission at the time, that provided a lovely conduit for the bringing together of what was happening within the academic institutions and what was needed to inform policy and practice in Queensland. And I think from that moment forward, we began to see a very different kind of criminology in the north than what had been there before. I think the reform of the police department was also particularly important for the advancement of Griffith in particular, and perhaps QUT to some extent as well. And in order to reform a policing society, there needed to be a lot of partnerships again with the academic institutions. And we had, at Griffith University at the time, we had Professor Ross Hommel, who is currently the Foundation Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Griffith University. But at the time that he was first appointed to the school, he was also working as a part-time commissioner for the Queensland Criminal Justice Commission. So there was a really nice segue in between the two that allowed criminology to flourish. And I also want to pay due respect to one of my mentors and someone who I esteem greatly, Professor Kathy Daly, an all-around criminology superstar in my mind, who is our past president of ANZSOC, as we know, and who I know, she doesn't said it, nobody else has said it, and I'm going to just burst the news out today, who is the recent recipient of another wonderful award to add to her extending trophy cabinet. She's recently won the Arts, Education and Law Research Leadership Award at Griffith University, and I would say well earned, Kathy, because your contributions were definitely important in shaping the direction, and I think that the depth of sociological and legal focus that I believe Griffith has become renowned for over the last years. So in contrast to Griffith, I think UQ was a rather slow burn, and it wasn't until 2001 when Paul Mazerol hit the scene fresh from the US and tasked with the responsibility of creating the first criminology major. UQ was really just kind of going along, doing its sort of criminology that was really housed within sociology, but hadn't really kind of put its own sort of identity on the map. And Paul Mazerol very soon changed that and quickly brought together a group of people to develop a major in criminology. And a fun fact for those of you who don't know this, Tara, our president, was actually the first UQ graduate with a PhD in criminology at UQ 10 years ago. And I think to the week, is that right? Close to?
I submitted my thesis 10 years ago, yes.
10 years ago, so congratulations for that. And so she's actually is the future, I think, of criminology going out of UQ, and is making wonderful contributions to Griffith now. So I think what this sort of leads me to suggest is that UQ now, with Professor Lorraine Mazerol at the helm of criminology and the continuation of partnerships with key agencies and organizations growing, there are real opportunities for advancement within UQ, and I think what we see now in Southeast Queensland are 3 amazing universities that are doing tremendous work and will continue to grow and develop in the years to come. Certainly the work of Kerry Carrington at QUT, the new postgraduate and undergraduate options through the Bachelor of Justice at QUT, and I actually want to tip my hat to our surfer friend, Professor Tim Prenzler, who is also heading up a new bachelor degree in criminology at the University of the Sunshine Coast, where he can balance his love for surfing and his love for criminology, I hope, in equal parts. So I think looking north and thinking about ANZSOC's reach and capability, the Southeast Queensland area in particular is growing in terms of numbers, in terms of students, in terms of energy, in terms of fantastic research that's being published here in Australia and also internationally. And I think we can safely say that Queensland is perhaps now an official player in the New Zealand-Australian Society of Criminology, and hopefully in the 50 years, I mean, I'll probably be decrepit at that time and not able to attend. I think I'll be nearly 100 if I make it to the 100th. But I'm hoping that the 100th anniversary we'll look back and see the contribution that Southeast Queensland has made to ANZSOC as a society, and also to the development and growth of criminology in Australia. So again, I thank you very much for your wonderful invitation today and for letting me give you a very brief snapshot of Queensland. Thank you.
Now I'd like to ask our current ANZSOC Treasurer, Dr. Lee Erickson, who's going to give us a snapshot of what's happening in the finances of the Society, past and present and future.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Russell. Distinguished guests, it is an honour to be here today to celebrate the 50th anniversary of ANZSOC, together with so many of you who have been instrumental in the establishment and the growth of this society. This session, I believe, is supposed to focus on the future of the society, but I'm going to bring you back in time. We're going to go back to 1967 and even before that. I'd like to pay tribute to the very first ANZSOC treasurer. Mr. David Hundley served as treasurer for the society between 1967 and 1969, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. I was not here. Unfortunately, David passed away in the year 2000 and therefore cannot be with us here today to commemorate this joyous occasion. However, through some joint detective work by myself and Russell Smith, I actually managed to track down David's daughter, Ellen. Ellen was very happy to speak with me and shared some fond memories of her father, some of which I would like to relay here today. David Handley was born in England. He served in the British military forces during World War II. Upon returning to England, he worked in a factory that produced aircraft parts. He felt that there was more to life than working in a factory. One day he spotted an ad that said, "Come to Australia, we'll give you an education." So he came to Australia. He completed a BA, he completed a diploma of social work, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that he was the first person to graduate with a diploma in criminology from the University of Melbourne. That was in 1963. David worked for a number of years within the prison service, particularly at Pentridge Prison, which we've heard about a bit today. Some of you work there or had connections with Pentridge. David Handley worked there the year that ANZSOC was established, 1967. And as many of you have pointed out, this was also the same year that Victoria became the last state to carry out the capital punishment. As you know, Ronald Ryan was executed on the 3rd of February 1967. David Handley knew Ronald Ryan through his work as a supervisor for classification and treatment of prisoners at Pentridge Prison. As you may have all guessed, David was opposed to the death penalty. In the years following Ronald Ryan's execution, David worked to improve the prison system. Among other things, he served as an expert witness on the Board of Inquiry into Pentridge Prison and discipline within the prison system. This was in 1973 and 1974. He also served on the Prison Advisory Council in 1974. Ultimately, however, the execution of Ronald Ryan left its mark, and David Handley moved away from criminology. Instead, he began working for the Royal Victorian Institute for the Blind, where he remained until his retirement in the mid-1990s. As I mentioned, unfortunately, David Handley died in the year 2000, and it's an honour for me to commemorate his name and legacy in this forum. Now, on to financial matters. The very first Treasurer's report was lodged in 1969. The accumulated ANZSOC funds in the first report was $1,359.74. In present value, so adjusting for inflation and other relevant indices, that equates to roughly $15,600. Since then, ANZSOC funds have grown by approximately 1,500%. Today, ANZSOC is in a very healthy financial position. We have approximately 256,000 in our accounts. This growth is due to various reasons, some of which we've heard today. We've seen a growth in memberships and interest in ANZSOC from the criminological community. We've held a number of very successful conferences where the proceeds have benefited the society. We've also received revenue from the journal, moving to Sage particularly. Now, the healthy financial position of ANZSOC means that we have funds available to support local activities and events. We have funds available to support postgraduates and early career researchers. We have funds available to support a number of prestigious grants, such as the Distinguished Criminologist Award, Adam Sutton Crime Prevention Award, etc. So to sum up, in the 50 years since ANZSOC's establishment, the Society has grown in numbers and interest. Today we are in a position to generously give back to the criminology community in Australia and New Zealand, and ultimately it is because of this community that we exist. Thank you.
I thought, in addition to former presidents and founding members and others, we should have someone who's currently working in criminology in this university. So I've asked Fiona Haynes, who's Professor in the School of Social and Political Sciences, which doesn't include the word criminology in its title, to come and tell us about what's happening here and what the future may be, and some observations on the society generally.
I really have two separate sections. One is reflections on the society, and the other reflections on criminology at Melbourne and its relationship to ANZSOC. In terms of the society, much has already been said, and I think you can break it down into two separate paradigms, if you like: infrastructural support and substantive direction. And I think we've heard very much some wise words from Kathy Daly and others in terms of the level of infrastructural support. When I was thinking about the strengths of ANZSOC, the first one that came to mind was longevity. It's actually quite hard to keep organisations, societies like this going. And I think it's in no small part because of the volunteers and because of the way that the infrastructural support has taken place. There are other professional societies often championed by a single institution, but this cuts across institutions, that in a very competitive environment where each institution is trying to promote their own benefit, that there has been this collaborative society that's succeeded and succeeded very well. In terms of one suggestion, just learning from Taza, some way of streamlining the conference in terms of conference organisers. Taza has managed to do a tender process and secured the conference organiser for 5 years at a fairly decent rate. And so I think there are opportunities there as the conference continues to grow. In terms of substantive direction, I think the society has managed some very difficult challenges extremely well. It is, I was trying to capture the right phrase, an umbrella organisation, a brokerage organisation. It has a huge mix of different scholars, different professions from different parts of the criminological world. And bringing those together and keeping the different perspectives together, I think on the whole ANZSOC has done very well. I remember a very tense meeting, I think it was here at the University of Melbourne, when Rob White made the decision to branch off and have a critical criminology society because of disappointment with the way that ANZSOC was going in terms of its critical direction. And I think there are always tensions in substance between, on the one hand, crime science, critical criminology, on the other, applied policy, and so on. And I think part of the challenge of the society is, in a sense, a challenge of diplomacy and keeping those various perspectives able to talk to one another in a collaborative. It doesn't mean you agree. I have my political science colleagues talking about agonistic theory, that there is value in difference. And I think what is problematic is when those sort of splinter off into their own directions. I applaud Antje's ideas for a New Zealand criminology, and I actually think Australia could learn a lot from what Antje was talking about. Not only in terms of the national broadband network, but also in terms of criminology itself. And I really would welcome that development. I was fascinated by the idea that Papua New Guinea might have been part of ANZSOC. And I have a number of colleagues, anthropologists, who are working in Papua New Guinea. And
my own area of white-collar crime, corruption, the skullduggery at the top, and Australia's current involvement in that through various deals that this is being recorded, I won't go into, I think there would be huge value in terms of thinking about trying to bring our colleagues from Papua New Guinea in some kind of conversation, both in terms of white-collar and corporate crime, but also in terms of the very real challenges they face in terms of street crime, and seeing what kind of learning might be possible from them as much as from us. In terms of criminology at Melbourne, I remember I began undergraduate criminology in 1985, and I was told that law and order was always a political winner. Well, I have to tell you, in Victoria in 1985 it wasn't. The crime surveys that were done at the time, it was about 5th or 6th on the public's list of the state issues of state that they were concerned about in the election. What we do know now is that law and order may not be criminologically successful, it is highly politically successful. It is a winning strategy, and I think perhaps trying to find ways of engaging to make it less politically successful, it remains a significant challenge. Criminology at Melbourne is blooming, and in Melbourne is blooming. We have at least 5 strong criminology teaching and research programs across universities: Melbourne, Monash, La Trobe, RMIT and Deakin. And each of these programs is vibrant in their own right and a source of energy and support for ANZSOC. We all benefit, each of the programs here benefit both from each other's success and also from our engagement with the society. In terms of Melbourne, we actually have an extremely broad program that's combined criminology, law and justice, and the sociology of law. We host one of the strongest undergraduate programs in the Faculty of Arts, with around 800 first-year students across 2 first-year subjects, so that's 800 in first semester and 800 in second. I know that this is a situation that is shared amongst our sister programs. Our program has a strong interdisciplinary focus, and sometimes maybe this hasn't sat entirely centrally within ANZSOC. Our academic staff are found across criminology, socio-legal studies, crime and the humanities, and history. Each of our academic staff has a significant profile, but maybe they don't always see their professional home within ANZSOC. I have some wistfulness in terms of my own area of white-collar crime that I don't see at the present time as having a very vibrant presence within ANZSOC, and for that reason I've often attended conferences with other societies. However, having said that, I have a very strong belief that the different perspectives that we have here at Melbourne University and in Victoria more broadly can engender vibrancy within ANZSOC as well as outside. Bridging and making the most of these different perspectives and vantage points seems to me a very successful strategy for ANZSOC as it's moving forward. And it was with that in mind that I put forward that we host the ANZSOC conference here next year to bring together established and new voices into the criminological conversation. We've had a number of really interesting conversations, and we're welcoming Rebecca Wicks, who's going to join us, I think it's this Friday, so we can continue that conversation. Our theme for the conference is Encountering Crime, Doing Justice, and we look forward to welcoming as many of you as can make it at that time. So thank you.
I'd just like to briefly thank everyone for being such careful timekeepers and not requiring me to wave my termination banner. And thank you all for coming along for the event. And as a special treat, I've graciously offered to drive those who are going to the airport in my 1967 Hillman Gazelle. So I'll pick you up downstairs. Life insurance should be paid up beforehand. And just to thank us and conclude the day's proceedings, I'll hand over to Tara.
Wow, this has been quite the day, hasn't it? Thank you to everyone for making the trip here today, whether it was across town or interstate or across the ditch. Thank you for coming.
Across the Pacific.
Indeed, Rick, you have travelled the furthest today. Thank you for making it. And thank you to the gods of Qantas for getting you here. So I'm confident that everyone here today will have learned something new about ANZSOC. I certainly have learnt quite a lot. It's been a pleasure to meet new people and also catch up with old friends. Today we've seen that the old social justice issues that were being dealt with 50 years ago are still being dealt with in some guise or another. And there are many challenges that have been set for us today, and I'm confident in the capacity of the current Committee of Management and with their enthusiasm to kind of tackle these as a professional body, but also the enthusiasm of the criminology community more generally in tackling the issues that we face today. I also suspect that at the centenary of ANZSOC, where I'm pretty sure I won't be alive for, many issues of social justice will still challenge our future criminologists. And as Ari said, we'll never be out of a job as criminologists. One of the ways in which we're trying to extend the presence of ANZSOC outside of the annual conferences, as Lee mentioned, is with local events across the states and within New Zealand. And I strongly encourage everyone to get along to these events if you can. They'll be advertised on the ANZSOC mailing list as they come out. Catalina will be promoting them left, right and centre for us. Comments today also about the cost of conferences are duly noted. The Vice Presidents and I are already working on ways to address this, but it will involve probably cutting elements of the conference, because although we've had successful conferences in the past that have created profits for the Society, our most recent conferences are coming in at cost neutral or at substantial contributions from the host university. In 2013, when Griffith hosted the conference, I know that substantial contributions were made by my head of school to make the conference come in at a slight profit. So we need to really rethink the way in which we do conferences and the level of perhaps catering that we offer. Rebecca identified that it was 40 to 50% of the conference budget was spent on food alone. So we will think about ways to make things work better so that we can have more people attending and engaging at conferences in the future. Once again, thank you for all your contributions today. As always, the strength of ANZSOC relies on what Kathleen Daly identified as our volunteerism. The success of ANZSOC today is in part the result of the efforts of those around the table today. And looking at the goodwill of the current Committee of Management, I'm pretty sure that the future is bright. By way of reminder, this event has been recorded and we will provide access to this, to the recordings to everyone today in due course. And finally, please thank me once again. Please join me once again in thanking Russell Smith who has really made today's event a reality. It's all down to Russell, so let's thank him now.